In the pitch darkness of the ancient cave, drops of condensation fell from the ceiling to the ground, cutting the silence with a soft sound. Suddenly, the wounded man fell to his knees through groans and screamed in pain. His friend immediately picked up his partner and asked if he was okay. Then the man in the cloak said that they didn't have much time left. The wounded fighter asked to be released. Immediately afterwards, he again lost his footing and fell to the ground. Looking at this, the cloaked man said that there were already many people who had already fainted. The fighters ahead of them looked at the poor man. One of them said that the healers didn't have much mana left. However, the injured man suddenly cut into the conversation and said he was fine. Suddenly, he looked excitedly straight in front of him and said that the hope of the Empire was with them. That day, at the head of the squad was a tall man in shining armor, whom all the subordinates called Warrior Vern. The knight turned around and looked at the wounded soldier with a smile. He said that he was glad to hear his subordinate's voice, because it meant that he was all right. After the guy shouted out that he was feeling great, Vern turned away. It looked like the squad members were beginning to feel uneasy. At the very beginning, the conquest team under his leadership numbered 74 men. Now only 43 remained in the formation. This thought made the legendary knight become extremely nervous. Gathering his thoughts, he thought that in this situation, he could not stick to the idea that he had lost 31 fighters killed. He must now realize that 43 men had survived. Yet despite the fact that all these seasoned and experienced fighters tried their best, they lost so many valiant adventurers. Vern looked sadly at his feet. Their losses were too great after all. Then the knight raised his head and examined the stalactites overhanging them. He thought that, in spite of everything that had happened, the fighters had been prepared for this outcome from the beginning. At that moment, none of the squad expected any other option from facing one of the 7 great evils of this world. This dungeon contained something that had made mankind shudder for centuries. The squad's objective was the core of primordiality. Suddenly, one of the fighters called out to the thoughtful Vern. After the leader's question about what had happened, the knight pointed a finger in the direction the squad was advancing. They saw a passage of enormous dimensions. The people looked like the most pathetic ants against it. Vern tensed. More than anyone else, they were close to their goal. Right in front of them was the end of the dungeon, the core of primordiality. The group made an incredible effort and expended a lot of human blood to get to this place. In addition, according to numerous reports and legends, there is such a huge amount of treasure stored at the end of the dungeon that no king can imagine. In addition, one of the finest creations created by mankind, called the 36th masterpiece, is kept here. And it's all guarded by the mysterious owner of the dungeon. Suddenly, the strongest vibrations shook the ground beneath the adventurers' feet. Realizing that the decisive phase of the battle might now be upon us, Vern ordered the squad to fall into formation. Conventional battle tactics dictate that shields and swords should become the front, and the role of the mages is to light up the place and maintain a field of vision for the entire squad. The whole ceiling of the cave was shaking. It seemed as if sharp stone stakes were about to fly down on the soldiers. This did not happen, however, and soon, to general surprise, the vibrations ceased. One of the strongest wizards said that they had better make the lights brighter now. After that, he asked the squad to stay alert. Following him, several wizards also illuminated the space around them. When visibility improved, the squad was startled to see a silhouette of incredible size. Suddenly, the creature opened its eyes and looked at the uninvited guests. Then the vibrations resumed, and the ground beneath the traveler's feet began to crack. For the first time in his life, Warrior Vern experienced an incredible, almost animalistic fear. Suddenly, the terrifying creature opened its mouth, revealing several rows of enormous, bloody teeth. A few seconds before the end of the battle, Vern shouted the order to retreat. Some time after the described events, the enraged skeleton offered to summarize the described story. From the story, he realized that the monster was asleep when the humans burst in. In response, the creature, overcoming fatigue, coped with them without difficulty. After re-describing the story, the skeleton asked if he had missed something. The monster replied that he had. Then he cocked his head and said that he had an aggravating circumstance, as he had to fight against 2 opponents at once, humans and exhaustion. The dark entity then turned to Pedric, who was beyond furious, and asked him to calm down. Unwilling to restrain himself, the skeleton shouted that he was incapable of holding himself together. Pedric pointed his finger at the monster and said that he couldn't believe that he had been asleep when the men entered the dungeon. Gesticulating in various ways, the skeleton would not calm down, and shouted out a situation where a majestic creature described in numerous legends was yawning right in front of the pitiful humans. Pedric was eerily pissed off at the situation, where the dark creature's mind and attitude was a big problem for them. He then pointed his hand at the boss again and looked away, and asked his partner named Reny what she thought about all this. The girl said that she had never heard of any monster sweeping away an entire squad of people with just one yawn. She then looked at the monster called Mr. Eater with loving eyes and let out a shriek of shock at his incredible dignity once again. Seeing that this psychopath was once again not supporting him, Pedric became even more nervous. The thought made his skull crack again. The skeleton thought that their community was turning into a madhouse. After that, Pedric sat back in his chair and realized that it looked like it was time for him to just give up. He grabbed his head with his hands and shouted that the dungeon was about to end. The eater saw this and said that the skeleton shouldn't be so nervous, or his bones would rot. This was what one of the 7 great evils looked like, which had finally become impossible for humans to conquer. This was the core of the primordial universe. By that point, the passage of most dungeons ended in an unqualified victory for the humans. Knights and a wide variety of adventurers could attack monster hideouts at any time, putting opponents in an unfair position. Repeating battles time after time with incredible speed weakened the dungeons. Over many millennia, an endless number of new monster sanctuaries have been built and cleaned up. However, the existence of special dungeons beyond anyone's control was obvious. The shelters that are most famous are those that people have implicitly dubbed the 7 great evils. These are places humanity has found impossible to conquer. Among these infamous dungeons of great evil, the worst in the demon world was considered the core of primordial evil. Dozens of the strongest monsters guarded the many passages of this cave. The gatekeepers of the 3 crossroads awaited the adventurers before the finale. Over many years of trying, humanity had managed to gather enough information about these creatures. The red crossroads on the left was defended by a dagger handmaiden named Reny. Defending the blue passageway in the center was a death knight, a skeleton named Pedric. The most unexplored was the right passage, which was nicknamed the Dirty Passage. It was defended by unknown mysterious tentacles. In addition, after passing one of the crossroads, the ruler of this impregnable fortress was waiting for the adventurers at the end. It was the original monster from the first pages of Imperial mythology, and his name was the Devourer. Slamming the book shut, Reny said it was all the important information about them. She then sat down and said that, as the master had predicted, there had been many more attacks since the distribution of this work. The eater patted his hand with a smile and told his subordinate that she should also learn how to manage the dungeon. The most important thing was to kick up some mystery, and people wouldn't even notice the catch. That's exactly how they should continue to spread the information. Then mankind will mistakenly think that they already have all the known information about the dungeon. This false confidence encourages them. So when people see half-fictional books, they flock to them like moths to a flame. And yet there was something that made the eater very wary. He admitted that he hadn't expected so many adventurers to flock here. He then looked at the bodies laid out to the side and asked how many men were in that squad. Reny replied that there were 74 knights and mages. However, most of their equipment melted away when they fought against Mr. 116 Black Tentacles. Only the most expensive weapons survived this battle. After that, the girl huffed and said that if she had the chance to fight, she'd probably deal without damaging anything. The eater looked tiredly at his subordinate and replied that he didn't doubt it. After that, his body rapidly began to change shape and transform. A few seconds later, the dark matter left no trace of the monster's familiar form. Suddenly, a human eye appeared in the dark blob, looking directly at Reny. Then, a dark hand appeared out of the matter and reached out to the girl. The eater, taking on human form, walked over to his subordinate and stroked her head. He said he had no doubt that she would have done much better. Reny got embarrassed and laughed. However, this situation displeased Pedric very much. He looked angrily at the monsters and asked if they were holding some kind of meeting here. The skeleton then glared angrily with his eyes and said that if they were just having fun now, why wasn't he laughing at all? Pedric then spoofed the other 2 monsters in his favorite manner, saying that he was in a very good mood and that he had caught a cavity by breathing in some air. But then he shook nervously and shouted furiously that it was not just about his teeth, as his head would also rot sooner or later. After that, the skeleton looked at the boss and said that if he wanted to change form, he should do it appropriately. After all, when the guy stroked Reny's head, he had as many as 6 fingers. When the Devourer thanked his subordinate, the skeleton laughed in response, saying that it was better than the last time the boss had over 40 teeth without seeing any problems. Pedric's laughter made his bones crunch loudly. Reny said that she just hated that sound as it made too much noise. Glaring furiously at the girl, the skeleton thought that it was time for her to quit her job as a dungeon protector if she's suddenly disgusted by such things. When everyone around them had more or less calmed down, Reny said it was time for them to get down to business. All the monsters sat down at the round table. The girl noted that as of late, it had been noticed that people were finally starting to attack the right intersection. The main problem is that Mr. 116 Tentacles, who was protecting the area, was severely damaged during the attacks, and his condition is rated as extremely critical. After saying that, the Eater yawned and asked his subordinate not to worry about it, because the power of tentacle regeneration was beyond her consciousness. He added that otherwise, if things were really bad, they could find a new protector. Suddenly, Pedric, hearing these words, asked his boss to look for 2 people for the role at once. He explained that he wanted to leave as well. The Eater surprisingly said that he didn't want to hear about it since the skeleton had a lifetime contract. The guy said that lately people only come to his right intersection at any given outcome. Pedric agreed with the Lord, adding that a new squad was probably already organized to attack them. Reny also picked up on the fact that people use telepathy magic as a means of communication, so news of the destruction at the dirty right intersection may have already spread. Hearing all these additions to the problem presented, the Eater pounded on the table and said that the situation had become clearer. He looked at his subordinates and said that they also needed to think about their defense during the next attack. Then the guy said that the 3 of them should switch positions. Looking at Reny, Eater said that the girl who had been protecting the red path on the left would now take care of the messy intersection on the right. He explained that the attackers would break in there thinking it was safer, and then she would take them in. Hearing this, Reny replied that she could stop any number of people from coming there. Then the Eater looked at Pedric and said that he would take charge of the red intersection on the left. The skeleton was puzzled and asked why he was getting that role. The guy explained that those people who realize there's Reny in the dirty intersection break into the red passage on the left where she usually dwelled, and then Pedric could stop them there. This tactic would help them fend off at least the next 2 attacks. Suddenly, the skeleton asked the boss to stop and said that he had another question. He then asked what the gentleman was going to do if people headed to the blue intersection down the center. There was a tense silence at the table for a while. The Eater explained that in that case, those who risked trying to break through the center would have to settle for a date with him. Skeleton sighed and said that it was a very confused plan. However, all his arguments were interrupted by Reny, who shouted that Mr. Eater had come up with a simply brilliant strategy. Seeing this, Pedric thought that there was nothing he could do about it. Then the girl calmly sat back down and summarized that they had discussed the main agenda. Now they had to decide what to do with that sword. The tired Devourer asked what it was about. Pedric replied that the girl was referring to the weapon the squad leader had used this time. The skeleton looked around and noted that these guys seemed to be very strong, carrying blades like that. The guy asked for a description of the weapon in question, and Pedric said he was sure the boss had heard of it before. Wandering around the corpses, the skeleton found the hilt of the very same sword. Stepping over the bodies of the slain, he reached over and grabbed the hilt of his blade. Pedric then swung the sword and said that it was the 36 masterpiece, which is an extremely famous weapon among humans. But suddenly, the skeleton realized that it was blade number 14, which is called Tannabella. The Eater scratched the back of his head lazily and said he remembered hearing about these 36 masterpieces before. He thought that there must be a few more of these things lying around in the corner of the vault. In addition, that unusual blade that Reny is using is also one of those masterpieces. Eater noted that the humans were using some pretty good weaponry. Pedric said that if they gave that blade to those monsters at the entrance, the humans would take it back. In that case, they would have another headache to deal with. With that thought, the skeleton walked over to the Lord and handed him the masterpiece, telling him that the lad would have to take it for himself. The Eater said in surprise that Pedric was using a sword, and it would probably be better for him to take the weapon for himself. At this generosity, the skeleton was taken aback for a moment and looked uncertainly into the Lord's eyes. He then asked again if it wasn't a joke, to which the boss replied that he didn't care about that piece of iron. After saying that, Pedric laughed and caustically muttered that in that case, he had no choice because it was the boss's order. This is exactly what that legendary primordial core looks like from the inside. This place has become home to a terrifying homunculus maid and a death knight that exudes grave energy. With that thought, the tired eater fell face down on the table and said that in that case, Pedric should tear up the letter of dismissal he had hidden in his ribs. That's how these three have been living here for years. Reny is a girl in a maid costume who thinks only of the eater. Pedric is the only one with common sense in the dungeon and an expert at annoying the boss, and also the eater himself, an ancient monster that epitomizes laziness and disinterest. After discussing the fate of the weapons, all three sat down at the table again. Reny asked the Lord what they should do with the rest of the profit sharing. At this point, Pedric thought he had enough of this sword. The eater said with some indifference that they should do as they usually did. They could take as much as they needed and use the rest to lure the next adventurers inside. The girl clapped her hands and said that she would then personally handle the distribution of the profits. Pedric thought sadly that the girl was going to be a slacker again. Suddenly, Reny reminded them that they couldn't use special magic items. The girl suggested taking out the mana stones and selling them to make extra profit. The eater looked tiredly at his subordinate and said that was a pretty good idea. He then suggested that in that case he would go to the human village to sell the loot. These words alerted both monsters. They looked fearfully at their master and synchronously asked him to repeat what he had said. The guy was surprised at the reaction of his subordinates and asked what they were so surprised about. Pedric said that it could be very dangerous and suggested to the boss to send Reny on this task. The girl was frightened by such an unexpected suggestion of her partner. The eater looked angrily at the skeleton and asked why he was so adamant about it. The monster replied that the Lord was still not good at turning into humans. The boy looked at the skeleton unhappily. Pedric asked angrily, was he wrong about something? Deciding that the subordinate was right, the eater turned to Reny, saying that she should buy a lot of goodies then. After these words, the girl headed towards the village. For the first time in a long time, her foot stepped outside the dungeon. Looking around, the creature noted that the weather was quite lovely and pleasant today. Taking one last look around, Reny remembered Mr. Eater again and mouthed that she would be back again soon. A while later, the girl reached the nearest feller's shop. The merchant looked with interest at the stones that the unknown girl handed him. Sometime later, he said in surprise that unfortunately, he could not buy back the crystals. Reny became very angry at what she heard and asked what was wrong. The fence said he would explain everything by example. Then he bent down and started looking for something under the counter. A few seconds later, the merchant placed a glowing crystal on the girl's pepper. He explained that this mana stone was a rank B. For a commoner like him to redeem something like this, he would need to work hard for 10 years. Then the miser looked at what the girl had brought and noted that she had obtained much more valuable stones. Only court mages or high-ranking wizards from the tower could use them. The merchant hesitated and said that a jeweler who had an agreement with the royal family or a wing from the mage tower could match these stones. Reny realized that the capital was far away from here and asked the miser if she should go to the mage's tower with all this goodness. It confirmed her hunch. The girl gathered the stones into a bag. She didn't want to go there, but she was willing to do anything for Mr. Eater. Heading for the exit, Reny said goodbye to the merchant, who wished her a good journey. The bulky man then looked around the counter and saw a huge blue crystal lying on it. He picked up the artifact and shouted to the girl that she had forgotten one stone from him. The unknown turned around and said she appreciated the information she got from the man, and this crystal was left to him as a tip. The door slammed shut, and the pleased miser thought it was the strangest visitor he had had in a long time. But what surprised him most of all was that the girl noted that he was human. It didn't take long for Reny to reach her goal. Just before sunset, she finally arrived at the wing of the mage tower. At the entrance, the girl explained that she had come to sell mana stones. The mage in front of her advised Reny to meet with the guildmaster to discuss the matter in detail. The cloth-clad man picked up the lantern and motioned for the girl to follow him to the head's office. Already at this point, Reny realized that the building was built in such a way that the guildmaster was at the very top. As the ranking mage guided her through the corridors, the creature realized that human towers were similar to their dungeons in their own way. In front of Reny sat a pleasant-looking woman dressed as a guildmaster. She greeted the traveler and thanked her for the long journey. The leader of the wing was called Gramit's Aimer. Then the woman stared at the traveler and asked her to introduce herself. The guildmaster's gaze alerted the monster. The creature thought that this person had an incredible supply of mana. The girl pulled her hood tighter and said her name was Ren. The guild leader explained that she initially wanted to ignore the visitor after hearing that some small child had come. However, the guard said that the girl had a lot of mana stones. Gramit's aimer looked warily at the visitor and said that the one must be well known to Wing. That was why the mage believed that Ren had brought high-quality mana stones that met their guild standards. After saying that, Reny opened the bag and poured out a multitude of crystals on the table, saying that the woman could test them herself. Gramit's aimer stared in amazement at the incessant stream of stones, unable to believe that a child could get such a thing anywhere. In front of her lay a handful of not expensive rank A mana crystals at once. The woman took one of the stones and examined it closer. She realized that some of these artifacts were of the highest quality, close to being the best among such a rank. The guild master couldn't understand where the little girl got something like this from. Gramit's aimer looked at the visitor sitting across from her. By the looks of it, it was the most ordinary child. The woman asked sternly, "Where did the girl get all this?" Suddenly, a young stranger's hair caught the guild master's eye. The woman remembered that one of the 8 greatest imperial families had silver-colored hair. Did the daughter of this clan run away and secretly bring these jewels here? The sorceress realized that there was no other way for a normal child to have these untold riches. She grinned and thought that such a young lady probably didn't know anything about the world yet. Gramit's aimer apologized for being rude and explained that it was impossible to imagine that the goods could be so good. She also assured that her guild would like to purchase all of these mana stones. As payment, the enchantress offered 50 ounces of gold coins for each crystal and 80 for those in particularly good condition. After the price tag was announced, Reny thought hard. It seemed to her that the payment for the crystals was very much underestimated. The words of the miser from the village came to the girl's mind. Then he said that a commoner like him would have to plow for 10 years to buy one stone like that. Through simple calculations, Reny realized that each of the artifacts presented to her must be worth at least 100 ounces of gold. After realizing this, she looked angrily at her interlocutor and said that if this was a joke, the man would die. The frightened Gramit's aimer interrogated the visitor, saying that she hadn't heard the last phrase. However, the sorceress thought to herself that this young lady was more knowledgeable than she had realized. Hearing no reply, the guildmaster said that, truth be told, their guild didn't have enough money to buy everything even if they raised all their funds. But Reny suddenly interrupted her interlocutor and said that then those could buy as many as they could. The woman swallowed and nodded her head. A while later, a chest of gold coins was placed in front of the monster. Gramit's aimer explained that there were 2,000 ounces. That was all the money the guild had. While the girl indifferently looked at the gold coins, the guildmaster offered to pay for the rest of the artifacts with items that equaled their value. Reny asked if her interlocutor was sure that the items she was proposing would be valuable and in demand. Gramit's aimer replied that there was no need to worry about that. The girl replied that she agreed, and the guildmaster muttered that they should go to another room. Walking up the stairs, the wing leader explained that they normally didn't take strangers to this place, but the current situation would be considered an exception. At the very top of the tower was the guild's main storage room. It was rather empty for its size. The first thing the guildmaster showed the girl was a tiara adorned with 4th carat diamonds. There were small mana stones in the middle, so this item was useful for mages. Then a living black pearl appeared in front of the child's gaze, which gives a signal if poison appears near the owner. This artifact was made by alchemists. The last words made Reny very wary. This ring was quite unusual. However, the girl did not want to get involved with alchemy under any circumstances. Seeing the visitor's displeased reaction, the guildmaster chuckled and realized that the young lady did not like the ring. Gramit's aimer replied that alchemy is an unhygienic field, and many people have an aversion to it. As the next option, the enchantress asked to draw Miss Wren's attention to the crystal heart. Smiling, the woman explained that the item was called Scarlet's Love Stone. This artifact could make the owner's love come true. What she heard made Reny freeze in place and stare in amazement at the stone. Running the last words over and over in her head, the girl couldn't believe that she had finally found what she needed. Gramit's aimer went on to describe this artifact, saying that the owner only needs to pour mana into this stone in front of a loved one, and the spirit within the crystal will help achieve immortal love. The girl leaned closer to the artifact and asked, "Does it work on absolutely anyone?" The guildmaster assured her that she could vouch for it, putting her title on the line. The enchantress noted that the young lady seemed to have taken a liking to the artifact in question. Not holding back her emotions, Reny shouted that she wanted that crystal. Suddenly, after these words, Gramit's aimer thought for a very long time, which alerted the monster greatly. The guild master explained that this stone was completely different from the others. It could be used to steal even an emperor's heart, so its value was higher than the other artifacts. This information shook Reny's confidence greatly. She was so close to realizing her dream. The creature thought hard. Gritting her teeth, she told the guildmaster that she could settle the matter. Pulling another item out from under her cloak, the girl explained, this could surely settle their argument. Gramit's aimer looked nervously at the object. In a trembling voice, the woman asked the child where she had gotten the blade. The young lady would not answer the question and said she wanted that artifact for all the money she had been given earlier, and on top of that, a weapon. After the visitor left, one of the high-ranking wizards fearfully ran up to the guildmaster. He asked the whistling supervisor how she could give some child the gem. Gramit's aimer replied that she did not see any problem with it. The guy with glasses shouted that the leader knew what this artifact was. Not calming down, he said that if he just gave this heart to the girl, she would surely die. The head of the organization took the approaching lens and asked, why should she care? Looking at the stones she received with interest, she said that some foolish aristocrat coveted this crystal and personally exchanged it. The wizard tried to object, but Gramit's aimer shut him up and said they would have no problem. Once the crystal is released, that girl will die, and the man she likes will follow her. Therefore, no evidence will be left behind. The guild head grinned and said that she didn't know who that second lover was, but she definitely felt sorry for him. Meanwhile, Reny had arrived at one of the 7 dungeons of the great evil called Chachti's castle. The woman standing behind her was skillfully waving a pair of scissors and a comb. When she took one of the hairs in her hands, she noted that the ends were dead. Reny apologized to her friend for showing up so suddenly. She said she was in debt every time she came here. The red-haired woman said the girl didn't have to make excuses, because it was the norm for neighbors to help each other. It was the boss of Chachti's castle named Elizabeth Bathory. Artificially wielding the scissors, she sighed and muttered that Reny's pretty face brought her happiness. Then she laughed and said that it didn't matter at all what she did with the girl's hair, as long as she still looked lovely. Taking another pair of scissors from the table, Elizabeth admitted that at times like this, she was very jealous that Reny was a homunculus. She stroked her acquaintance and said that she still couldn't believe that her beautiful face wouldn't age at all. Also, Reny's face looks very young, and much paler than Elizabeth's own. When the haircut was finished, the owner of the castle ripped the cape off her client. She complained that the girl couldn't even imagine how much blood she had to spend to maintain her beauty. With an indifferent glance at the remains standing at the other end of the room, Reny twiddled her foot and turned to Miss Bathory. The girl was embarrassed and asked her acquaintance what she thought of her. Looking at her co-worker, Elizabeth smiled and said that Reny was the most beautiful girl she had met in a while. She approached her friend from behind and, scrunching up her nose, assured her that no one would dare reject her. Elizabeth then asked in surprise, why did Reny even want to embellish herself? It was rather unexpected. After a short silence, Miss Bathory asked in surprise if the neighbor was going to confess to someone. The girl went to the mirror and looked down. In her hands was the very crystal heart she had bartered with the humans. Reny then smiled and looked at her friend enthusiastically and said that she really wanted to do it. Elizabeth looked at the girl's frantic face in surprise. She then asked in amazement, is that really true? Miss Bathory shrieked that she had said all this in jest and asked the question, who was the lucky man? Reny looked with loving eyes somewhere off to the side and replied that it was Mr. Eater. After hearing this, Elizabeth looked at her friend no less surprised. Then the vampiress shook herself. Grinning, she noted that the girl must be throwing around such heavy jokes because of being a homunculus. However, Reny looked angrily at Miss Bathory and said that she wasn't joking at all and was going to confess her feelings to Mr. Eater. Elizabeth slapped her forehead and muttered that she didn't understand at all why the girl liked that bastard, adding that no one had even been able to determine his strength. Reny contradicted her friend and said that it wasn't true at all. Eater-san really has a lot of strengths and can be relied on. An uncomprehending Elizabeth shouted that this type is so lazy that his laziness overrides all his reliability. The girl replied that she realized that he was huge and lazy, and that he ate like a pig and slept every day, wherever, whenever, and as much as he wanted. In addition, Mr. Eater snores terribly, is not very smart, and is quite voracious. Miss Bathory was surprised that her neighbor knew about all these flaws, but still loved the bastard. Reny looked down sadly and replied that it was indeed true. Folding her arms, she smiled and enthusiastically said that she really loved him. Elizabeth patted her friend on the shoulder and said that she understood her attitude. The vampiress added that she still thought Reny was too good for him. The hottie then winked at her neighbor and told her that if the type rejected her, she could come to her. After saying that, Reny smiled and thanked Miss Bathory for the support she needed. Still clutching the crystal heart in her hands, the girl thought that she would definitely succeed. Meanwhile, the situation in the imperial capital of Riaz was extremely tense. An important meeting was being held at the headquarters of the Dungeon Raiders Union. The main agenda was the last trip to the core of the primordial universe. The reporter, who was one of the mages who had been in contact with Vern Hishutalt's warrior unit to the last, ended his report with a disappointing conclusion. According to their assumptions, the raiders had been destroyed. There was silence in the hall after these words. Suddenly, one of the council members jumped up from his seat and, slapping his hand on the table, shouted that it was impossible. Glaring angrily at the chairman, he asked, "Hadn't Vern Hishutalt's squad reported that they had managed to pass through the gate guards with ease?" At the same time, a clear sense of excitement began to be felt in the conference room. Someone remarked that the bodies had never been found, so it was impossible to say with certainty that all the fighters had died. Some confidently corroborated these statements, insisting that there was no way a man like Sir Vern would have died from the clutches of monsters. Listening to the incessant scolding, the council chairman covered his face with his hands. He realized that the primordial core was no ordinary dungeon. There were only two ways out of it, either kill everyone or be killed. However, it had been a full 2 days since the last squad sent there had contacted headquarters. All the laws of logic and common sense said only that Sir Vern Hishutalt had perished along with all 75 of his fighters. Nevertheless, there was still some hope in the hearts of the people. Realizing this, the chairman turned to the envoy, asking what then had become the family sword of the Hishutalts. After a brief pause, the mage explained that communication with the squad had broken down when they entered the heart of the core. Then he added that only if one re-entered that area could one get the 14th masterpiece back. This news shocked the entire council. Everyone present realized how serious the loss of Tanabella was. Someone called for a new group to be sent immediately to retrieve the sword. In response, another council member shouted that they couldn't do that since even Vern's unit had failed. To prevent possible casualties, they should surrender. Opponents of this idea argued that one couldn't just back out, as Sir Hishutalt must have fought a boss that must have taken a lot of damage. The adherents of the immediate action theory also backed up their words by saying that while they were talking, the boss was healing his wounds and reorganizing the dungeon. They believed that they should gather new forces and finish off the monsters as soon as possible. The solution to this issue had completely fallen apart on the chairman. He realized that humanity had already lost one of the 36 masterpieces and a warrior that the royal family valued. If they dressed up this time, there would definitely not be a third chance. Otherwise, if left as it is, the royal family, enraged by such losses, will turn their blades on the Raid Alliance. The main unresolved issue at the moment was the current state of the dungeon boss. No one could accurately predict how much damage Mr. Vern was able to inflict on this creature. In addition, the state of the dungeon after the raid was also unknown. Realizing that even a few consecutive attacks wouldn't be able to take the primordial core out of play, the chairman made a difficult decision. He affirmed that no further action on the dungeon was possible. Such an uncompromising response shocked most of the board members. Suddenly, footsteps were heard from the direction of the entrance. An unknown voice said in a mocking tone that all these arguments were very intriguing. However, I wondered why the council had decided in such a way. The chairman looked straight in front of him and saw a man in a cassock standing across from him. After examining the symbols on the unknown man's cloak, the old man was horrified. He asked, what had the academic community of royal mages forgotten here? The young guy who was clearly the leader of the invading squad of the Third Eye faction asked with a smile, was the council unaware of who was giving orders to their community? The chairman of the Raid Alliance was horrified. It was now clear that the royal family had already begun to interfere. Meanwhile, the young mage began to go around the round table where the council members were sitting. He said that the fact that they were here meant that the Raid Alliance would have to pay for its sins. The fellow looked at the old men with hatred and said that these fools were not only guilty of killing a precious warrior, but they had also lost the masterpiece that the emperor held so dear in the enemy's lair. In response, none of the council members uttered a word. Despite the obvious bias, everyone realized that they were indeed at fault. The magician then placed his hand on the shoulder of one of the bureaucrats and said that even if everyone here died, there would be no one to manage the countless imperial raiding parties. With a smile after looking around at everyone present, the guy said that they had found a solution. His organization had made a sound proposal to His Majesty that would help save the lives of the raid's Union Council members. He then looked into the chairman's eyes and said that they would head to the core of primordiality once again. The old man realized that this would not only affect Third Eye, but also his fighters. So he said that they could not succeed in a place where even Sir Vern had failed. However, the guy in the cassock at this point turned away from the Raid Alliance and, spreading his arms out to the sides, said one word, Nifrim. The council immediately began a panicked discussion of what had been said. No one could believe that the Third Eye would dare to do such a thing. The chairman looked at the lad questioningly and asked if he was referring to that troubled history. The wizard raised his hands again and with his head back up said that Nifrim was not a failure, but an undeniable success. Suddenly, he struck the table with the palm of his hand and, approaching the chairman, asked why Sir Vern and his troop could not get out of the dungeon alive. After all these rugged fellows were not weaklings and certainly not sloppy. Hearing no reply, the Third Eye member sat down on the table and explained that that was not the case. Then the problem of this defeat was something else. The main conclusion was that Sir Vern Hishatu and his squad were definitely missing something. The magician said that if these guys possessed just one thing, they could come back alive, and Nifrim is the one who has it. The wizard shouted that they would definitely make progress on this raid. Meanwhile, the eater was wandering around the caves and wouldn't stop sneezing. Looking around tiredly, the lad thought he sensed something ominous, as if a great disaster was looming over them. Then he sneezed with all his might, turning into a monster from the exertion. The eater realized he was sick. A while later, the guy struggled to keep moving through the corridors. He didn't feel like doing patrols, but he doesn't know when people might attack. So if he continued to procrastinate, Pedric might scold him. Remembering his subordinate, the eater thought that this monster was too noisy for an ordinary bag of bones. Saying this phrase over and over again, the guy finally sank to the ground and almost fell asleep. Lest he fall into slumber, the monster rose to his feet, muttering that he couldn't waste any more energy on this. After analyzing the last fight, he thought that this time people came from the area near the dirt road. It might be worth going there now as well. A while later, the boy reached the 116 black tentacles. The monster was a pitiful sight now. Through the black mess, the eater saw his minion's eye. The boy looked sadly at the creature and thought that there was nothing he could do now. The only thing left to do was to wait for recovery. With that thought, he went to the next room. The main obstacle in the way of humans at this stage was Anthroporigo. Now this monster was also defeated. Eater jumped on the creature looking for its center. The peculiarity of this monster is that if it has a main body and nourishment, it will regenerate on its own. Seeing the eye still functioning in the core, the guy was convinced that the main body was still alive. Accordingly, there would be no need to interfere with the recovery process. Seeing its master, the monster closed its only eye and continued to rest. The boy turned around and jumped off the creature's carcass. Once on the ground, he thought, there was one problem after all. A huge hole gaped in front of him. A human raid had raised the first 4 rooms to the ground. Scratching his neck, the eater realized that this was something he should discuss with Pedric, who would probably yell at him again. Thoughts of the many things to do ahead brought fatigue back upon the lad, and he yawned loudly. He stared blankly straight ahead and decided to think about the rest later. Surely he should rest now as well. Even though the guy had only checked out the dirt road and the 5th room, he thought he still did a good job. Turning around and heading toward the main den, the eater thought Pedric would understand him. Suddenly, something glinted behind him. The monster thought that this was finally the end of the patrol, and at the same second, something flew past his ear. Before he knew it, an unusual dagger was stabbed into the wall in front of him. From nerves, the eater amplified his aura multiple times and looked askance at what was happening behind his back. Seeing the approaching boots, he thought, these human brats have had enough of him. The monster turned around and looked at the man. He shouted that anyone who steps beyond the threshold of this place may not think of escape. After a second, however, the boy stopped talking and looked at the approaching shadow in bewilderment. The unidentified intruder was Reny. She began to apologize to Mr. Eater, justifying herself by saying that she had mistaken him for just another lowly human. The guy angrily asked the subordinate if it was her blade. The girl excitedly apologized to her boss once again. The eater said it was fine. not considering that he only jumped up in fright. However, it was something else that caught his attention the most. Reny didn't look like herself at all right now. The boy noted that she had dressed up nicely. This sign of attention pleased the girl greatly, and she said enthusiastically that she was happy that Mr. Eater had noticed the change. Wanting to know the reason for this, the boy asked, "Had something special happened?" In the back of his mind, he hoped that Reny hadn't decided to change her maid's uniform because she wanted to get out of here before Pedric did. The girl confirmed the boss's speculation, saying that something special had indeed happened. Suddenly, she asked the gentleman if he could spare her a little time. Being very frightened, the boy agreed. He thought that he was ready to listen to any nonsense as long as it was not a petition for dismissal. Following Reny, the Eater found himself in one of the caves. The subordinate said she had brought the boy to her secret place. She offered the gentleman a comfortable seat here, while tea was prepared. The Eater smiled, but still hoped that no one would ask him to leave. A while later, Reny brought tea and poured the contents into the boss's cup. She said with a smile that before this place was known only to her, but now the guy was also privy to her secrets. With shaky hands, the Eater brought the mug to his mouth and sipped. He knew this wasn't what he'd been called here for, and he was still worried that the topic of conversation wouldn't be dismissal. The girl asked the gentleman if he remembered that it had been a full 80 years since he had sheltered her here. The guy looked at his reflection in the tea and mouthed that this was one he wouldn't forget. At that time, raid sweeps gained a lot of popularity, and over 1,000 different dungeons fell. The number of people who had reached the primordial core had also exceeded all acceptable norms. That's when Reny's status soared to unbelievable levels, and she even acquired her own nickname. Still drenched in sweat from excitement, the Eater said he remembered that time perfectly well, and asked about his subordinate's right eye. Reny squeezed her dress and was glad her boss hadn't forgotten about her eye. The guy grinned and replied that he would always remember the situation. In response, the girl said that she was happy to protect him then. The last phrase made the Eater very wary. He looked fearfully at his subordinate. What she said last was very much like parting words. Reny then looked confidently into her boss's eyes and turned to him. Mentally, the Eater was tearing himself to pieces, praying that no one would ever ask him to be fired again. But suddenly, the girl said that she liked the Lord very much. These words threw the monster into a stupor. Looking at the fact that the boss couldn't come to his senses, Reny repeated what she had just said. Clasping her hands together, she said she had waited all 80 years for this moment. The Eater hesitantly tried to say something, but his suddenly grown tail prevented him from gathering his thoughts. Overcoming himself, the guy scratched his neck and thanked the girl for admitting it to him. However, he then reminded his subordinate, their lives are always in danger. The Eater reminded her that they didn't know when they would suffer and die. He then asked the girl if she wanted to spend the rest of her days alone afterward. Reny lowered her head sadly and said that it turned out just as she had envisioned. The creature said she knew it would be an onerous request. However, the girl admitted that she could no longer contain those words inside her. Reny said she couldn't imagine Mr. Eater rejecting her and leaving. Suddenly, she pulled the crystal heart out of her back and mouthed that she was getting too scared to think about it like that. The boy examined the artifact in the beauty's hand in surprise. Reny had said she'd always wanted Mr. Eater to love her, no matter what it took. Suddenly, with one swing of her leg, she tossed aside the table in front of them. After that, the girl looked angrily into the eyes of her lover and shouted that she was ready even to commit a low deed. The guy tried to calm her down, but it was clearly impossible to do so. Suddenly, Reny held out an artifact to the Lord and said that with this, her wish could become a reality. But suddenly, the Eater's eyes filled with incredible fright. The girl explained that it was only necessary to put a little magic into it. Suddenly, the Eater's body gradually began to lose its human form. The guy shouted furiously, questioning his subordinate about what she had just done to him. Reny looked at what was happening, frightened, not understanding anything. Dark matter loomed over the poor girl. The Eater asked, "Did the girl really want to kill him?" The frightened Reny, looking around confusedly, did not hold the crystal with her trembling hands. Burning with a bright red light, the heart fell to the ground and shattered. The girl looked at the ground and couldn't believe her eyes. Barely holding back the coming tears, she tried to figure out what was going on. It seemed to her that there was an unknown entity looking directly at her from the shattered artifact. A while later, Pedric saw that the boss had finally awakened. He shouted sarcastically that the Devourer was simply the best of the lot. Jumping around the dark creature, the skeleton exemplarily marveled that the boss didn't stop at just chasing the humans away. At the same time, he had kicked out Reny as well. After that, Pedric went into a frenzy and shouted that he was in such shock that he couldn't even shut up. He explained that the Eater's power really didn't know the difference between friends and enemies. Realizing what had happened not too long ago, the monster asked his subordinate how he could fix it all. Skeleton said that it was the boss himself who arranged such a mess, so let him solve the problem. After a short pause, when Pedric had calmed down a little, he said that still the blame did not lie entirely with the Lord. With those words, he crushed a piece of crystal heart picked up from the ground in his hand. Yet then the skeleton shouted out that the way the Lord had treated him was definitely his fault. The Eater pretended not to understand what he was talking about, and said that he had forgotten all about it. Pedric was furious, and muttered that it looked like he was going to have to be reminded what it was all about. The skeleton reminded him that he was just nearby at the moment of highest insanity. Running up to the scene, Pedric noticed that the gentleman was completely out of control, and in doing so, Reny was in great danger. The skeleton realized that he didn't have much time left to stop the true monster from awakening. Running closer to the master, he grabbed the body by the head and asked the boss to stop. However, the boy's face was completely deformed. Pedric realized that there had been a change in the Eater's perception of what was happening as well. The skeleton had no idea what had happened here. However, his attention was then drawn to the crying Reny. The girl sat on her knees and looked at her broken heart with frantic eyes. She kept repeating that she couldn't do it. Pedric tried to shout to his partner and ask her to get away, leaving this fight for him. But the girl didn't hear him at all. Having no idea what had happened here, the skeleton nevertheless quickly realized that she was in no condition for his words to reach her. Reaching for his weapon with his hand, Pedric decided that the girl would only be in his way now. With one sharp swing, he hit Reny and threw her back a few dozen meters. The girl wheezed in surprise, gradually coming to her senses. The skeleton apologized to his partner, saying that he saw no other option right now. After making sure that Reny had fallen far enough, Pedric turned around and looked at his boss. Suddenly, the huge dark matter turned to a subordinate. The Eater asked, had the skeleton also come to kill him? While telling all this, Pedric didn't keep grabbing his head time after time, causing awkward looks from his boss. Finishing his explanation, the skeleton asked, does the master not remember anything? The Eater covered his limb in shame and apologized to his subordinate. Pedric patted the slumped boss and said it was good that he had come to his senses quickly. Still, the skeleton couldn't understand why the Lord acted like that. The Devourer asked if he should seek out Reny. The henchman replied that the Lord was asking very trivial things. The guy admitted that he thought the skeleton would say the opposite, to which the subordinate replied that it was a shame, because it was Reny who was very important to the dungeon. This girl cooks the food and monitors the diet of the other monsters. She also cleans and restores the dungeon, heals creatures, and sets traps. Reny also does consulting and solves each room's problems, sells treasures and distributes the proceeds, and keeps track of the ledger. Pedric explained to his boss that the wench practically runs the dungeon proper, and her absence threatens their existence. The Eater said he understood that, though he was having a hard time accepting it. Skeleton kept urging his boss that finding Reny was simply necessary before it was too late. The monster explained that even if one had to bow to her, one would have to beg and grovel. While the Devourer was regaining his human form, Pedric persisted, saying that he should kiss the girl's heels, only to return her under any circumstances. The skeleton then held out an object and said that if the master was going to go in search of a subordinate, he should take this. This artifact is called a Demura. This bracelet allows you to stabilize your mana. Pedric said the guy shouldn't know anything except that this artifact is very expensive. The skeleton explained that the Lord's body was suffering due to the backflow of mana, so it was difficult to understand its effectiveness. Pointing out that the Eater once again had 6 fingers on his hand, the monster added that even if the effect was minimal, it should help to at least avoid unnecessary suspicion. The guy looked angrily at his subordinate and said that his willingness to do anything sometimes pissed him off. When asked where the skeleton had gotten the artifact, the monster said that he had picked it up on the way. Looking at the gentleman staring at the bracelet frantically, Pedric asked him not to abuse the effect. Besides, this artifact is not strong enough. At this point, the guy interrupted the annoying subordinate, saying that he himself would realize the full effect while using it. Waving goodbye, he muttered that he was leaving the place in Pedric's charge for the duration of his absence. The skeleton said irritably that the gentleman would be gone for a while. Lastly, the monster added that the boss needed to arrive back within the next 5 days. He predicted that people would be here in about that time frame. Eater said he'd try to manage as long as those raiding bastards got here. Pedric ended by saying that no one knows what will happen if he fails to fight back and the humans get to that very spot. So the skeleton showed his 5 bony fingers and asked the Lord not to forget this deadline. The Eater said he heard everything perfectly. The next second, Pedric shouted to the departing gentleman that he should beware of the villages and not draw attention to himself. After all, if people found out that they could transform, the dungeon would have additional problems. The guy glanced behind his back and said he wouldn't have a problem with that, and if he did, he'd just destroy everyone. After the gentleman left, Pedric pulled a leaflet from his cloak. It was much worse than he had imagined. In no time at all, Reny was able to go and trade the brachycephalic tooth for a mana stone that had a demon hidden in it. Apparently, this caused the boss to go crazy and almost killed her. Skeleton realized that if the Eater found out what had happened, he would simply kill all the people he could find. Flipping through the pages of the newspaper, Pedric thought that it was too early for humanity to lose. Suddenly, news unnoticed by him before caught his attention. When the monster read what was written on the page, there was no limit to his horror. The article had a headline in large print, stating that the headquarters of the Dungeon Raid Union was going to go on the attack against the core in 3 days. Just then, the information he had recently given his boss about the safe time limit of 5 days popped into the skeleton's head. The reading made Pedric's skull crack even more. He realized that the situation he had created could be critical to the fate of the entire dungeon. Meanwhile, the Eater teleported to some abandoned area. Looking at the vortex his body had created, the guy looked around and thought that once again something had gone wrong for him. His second consecutive teleport attempt failed again, and here he was once again in some unbelievable place. At this point, he remembered Pedric's admonition that the mana in his body was circulating chaotically, so using magic would be the wrong decision. The Eater looked at his hand. He wondered if magic was causing such chaos. The boy sprawled out on the ground again and thought he might as well try again. As an arrival point, he tried to set the coordinates where Reny had gone to sell the mana stones he had obtained. This place was Haston Village. A few seconds later, the dark matter transformed into a single stream that rushed into the sky with great speed. Meanwhile, in one of the dungeons, a majestic demon sat on a high throne. The female-faced monster was surprised that a troop of humans had come all the way here to die at her hand. The knight standing in front of the group of raiders grinned, surprised that such a low demon was acting so arrogant. As he readied his sword for battle, the man said that they were members of an elite squad ranked 32nd in the Imperial rankings. Pointing his blade towards the demon, he mouthed that his high-class warriors of the mercenary squad called the Yellow Dawn Tigers would deal with the monster without a second thought. The swordsman looked angrily at his opponent and said that they would make a name for themselves on this continent. And today, his boys would throw the bestiary off the undeserved throne. The monster looked emotionlessly at the fools and said that they were making a big mistake. Insert from her throne, the monster announced that she was the 17th heiress of the demon king Asmodeus. Amplifying her aura to a fighting state, the girl shouted out that her name was Melja de Lymph Agrea. She looked madly at the presumptuous humans and added that they were honored to hear that name and accept death at her hands. The leader standing in front of the squad got a little nervous, but immediately told his partners that he would do everything himself. After that, the guy took off lightning fast. He fearlessly lunged at the demon, screaming that he would make the creature swallow its own words. The monster turned sideways and began spinning his staff at breakneck speed. The raider realized that normal arrows would not damage the demoness under any circumstances. After the creature fought back, one of the mages asked the captain to leave the matter to him. Looking at these endless endeavors, the monster shouted that the pathetic humans, as usual, didn't know their limits. The monster swung its staff with incredible speed, creating a powerful magical flow. Purple flames rained down on the fighters behind the leader's back, toppling them onto their backs and burning them on the spot. The raider leader turned around fearfully and saw another stream heading in his direction. The guy reacted and quickly thrust his sword into the ground. Almost immediately, he drew his blade and swung it over his head. The slabs torn from the ground blocked the oncoming flames. The raider looked up confused and saw blue crystals flying past. He was surprised to see ice shards appear here. Looking straight ahead of him, the boy saw something that made him cringe. Above its head, the monster created something that looked like a bristling ice crystal. The adventurer could not believe that the creature had prepared a new spell so quickly. Automatically acting on practiced movements, the raider grabbed one of the slabs flying by. In the same second, he hurled a shard of plating at his opponent, screaming that he wouldn't let go of the monster so easily. Just then, the knight rushed swiftly in the direction of the demon. The monster split the gathered crystal into several individual shards and aimed them at the humanoid, shouting that the fool should not beg for death. However, the ice spears shattered with a crackling sound against the barrier the knight had suddenly created. Melia was surprised that this worm had time to react so quickly. Besides, it was highly questionable that the knight was able to create such a spell. However, the demon was sure that she had managed to get rid of the mage. Looking around the other end of the room, the monster couldn't believe its eyes. The other two members of the squad were struggling to stay on their feet. The mage, held by the gunner, was using spells with his staff. The demon was furious at what she saw. She focused the magic in the palm of her hand again, shouting that she hated those damned bugs. It was the second time since the start of the fight that the opponents had engaged in close combat. Suddenly, however, something sparkled brightly near the ceiling. Dozens of debris rushed to the ground in the same second, pinning down the fighting opponents. One of the stones flew into the knight's head and he was thrown aside. The demon also didn't expect anything like this. Stunned by the sudden blow, the monster fell backward. The eyes of both opponents were expressing a complete misunderstanding at that moment. The human and demon had a similar question in their minds. What was it? The debris created a huge cloud of dust. The silhouette of the unknown man was faintly visible in it. The other adventurers immediately ran up to the captain and helped him up. The leader asked his subordinates who was that. He also added that he had not heard that another raiding party was on its way here. Meanwhile, the monster on the other side of the dust cloud leaned uneasily on one of the debris. Melja de Lymphe. Agreya stared fearfully into the unknown. She was greatly surprised that there was another unit lurking here. If that was the case, then the human forces were strong enough to break into the Demon King's fortress. The situation was getting out of control. It was urgent to determine which enemy she was dealing with this time. Suddenly, the unknown man turned toward the raiders and called out to them. This strangely dressed man with a tired look asked if the adventurers knew where the village of Haston was. After these words, there was a dead silence. The people looked questioningly at the strange man who had appeared out of nowhere. The demon also devoured the strange weirdo with her gaze, completely unsure of what to expect from him. Suddenly, both opponents asked the same question. They didn't understand why a strange type was talking some heresy right after suddenly appearing and trashing everything here. While the Devourer scratched the back of his head, one of the adventurers said he'd better get away from this demoness. The guy looked at the shabby girl across from him, who was saying that she wouldn't lose even if there were more pathetic humans. That was when he realized how different she was from the older Demon Kings. That must have been the generation gap. Meanwhile, while the monster and the raiders were exchanging curses, one of the adventurers said that a support squad had arrived. The leader said that was great and suggested they attack together. The eater raised his hand and asked those present to pay attention to him first. However, no one heard him anymore. The boy tried to remind them that he was looking for Haston's village, but the people had already attacked the demon. While the eater was trying to get some information, the monster girl was screaming that people were talking too much and responding with her spells to the raiders' attacks. The debris of the building began to fly in the space around him. Realizing that he was unlikely to get anything out of these incompetents, the eater sat down sadly. With a frustrated look, the guy looked around at his surroundings and thought that he was getting pretty pissed off already. Then he looked thoughtfully around the ruined ceiling. He had to hurry and find Reny. Rising to his feet, the monster turned away, realizing that his talk would accomplish nothing. At this rate, Pedric would kill him. Suddenly, one of the men called out to the stranger standing off to the side. However, the guy who was trying to think hard couldn't stand it and took his true form. A huge blob of dark matter appeared in place of his head and pounced on the terrified raiders. The knights and mages, who had never encountered anything like this before, screamed and cried like children before dying. The dark matter stunned and tortured them, tearing their bodies into small pieces. It seemed to the victims that the torment would last forever. Only a few seconds passed, and the eater's body took on its usual human form. Melja de Lymphe Agreya watched fearfully as the strange stranger swallowed up an entire squad of raiders in the blink of an eye. After that, the guy let out a loud burp, making the girl stiffen. For the first time in her life, she found herself so thoroughly confused that she could barely find the words. Melia turned to the guy and said that from what she saw, he was much stronger than she was. Suddenly, the demon's eyes sparkled brightly. The girl squealed enthusiastically that she was interested in the guy for the first time. Melia told the stranger she wanted to know more about him. Before the eater knew it, the girl was pouncing on him with more questions. She was interested in everything from the boy's name to the secret of his power. However, the monster itself was only disgusted by such a situation. Such behavior was strange for some girl who was seeing him for the first time in her life. Finally, the demoness must have realized that these questions sounded strange. With a wave of her hand, she said she should introduce herself first. Adopting an enigmatic pose, the girl said that she was a great demon king, the 17th heir of Asmodeus, named Melja de Lymph Agrea. Thinking that such a gesture might be an indication of trust, the demoness asked the guy what his name was. However, the same emotion of disgust still lingered on the eater's face. The girl was strange enough after all. Still, as disgusting as it was, the eater needed to get at least some information. Raising his hand in a welcoming gesture, the guy wanted to introduce himself. However, he stopped at the last moment. At that moment, the eater remembered that Pedric had told him to be careful. Indeed, if one simply revealed his identity, rumors would spread quickly. Especially now, there was no need to reveal all the cards. Trying to come up with an excuse on the fly, the guy awkwardly mumbled that his name was Reny. As the demoness struggled to pronounce the name, the eater thought it sounded really stupid and needed to come up with a better name. The girl, however, had no misgivings about such an introduction. With a twinkle in her eye, she asked if she could address the boy as Sir Demda. After a positive response, Melja said she wanted to start by thanking the stranger for his help, even though this attack was too aggressive. The guy said it was no problem for him. The girl puffed up her cheeks unhappily and said that without outside help, she could have lost so miserably to people. The eater noted that such a situation had not happened by his will. Melja replied that she did not care, for now it appeared that she owed the boy. Then the girl asked, "What does Mr. Demda want?" The eater was pleased and asked hopefully if the girl knew how to get to Haston. At this point, the demoness grinned and repeated the name of the village. The boy was glad, because from the look of her, Melji had information about this place. Then the eater made sure he'd made the right choice in killing people, not her. But suddenly, the demoness's eyes glowed even brighter, and she asked, "What is Haston?" In an instant, the eater's elation was replaced by utter disappointment. Suddenly, he thought about the girl's words. Judging by her question, she not only didn't know where it was, but she had never heard of the village at all. There was only one explanation for such a reaction. It seemed that the guy had gotten so far that this deviless didn't even know where a settlement with such a name was located. Trying to get some information, the Devourer asked the interlocutor if she knew where the nearest human village was. This question also caused some difficulty. After a few seconds of thought, the girl answered that, according to her information, the nearest town was called Reny. When he heard the familiar name, the eater's head snapped up. It was clear that this was the capital of the empire. If the girl is telling the truth, the boy is in a terrible situation. From Reny to Haston is at least a 2-month carriage ride. When he realized this, the eater slumped to the ground. Melja looked at her companion in bewilderment and asked if he was all right and if anything was bothering him. Realizing that the guy had gotten to the wrong place, the girl said that it was possible to use the teleportation center. The eater looked questioningly at her interlocutor and interjected with a question about something she had just said. Melja was surprised that the stranger had never heard of it. The Teleportation Center is a human invention that was created with the help of magic and alchemy. It has the function of being able to summon transference magic through its own powers. The guy lifted himself off the ground and said he was interested in it. He asked the interlocutor where this machine was located. Melja smiled, pleased that she was able to help the unknown man in some way, and added that the teleporter was in Reny. A while later, the two heroes traveled to the capital of the human empire. In the center of the city, the girl said that except for here, there was nowhere to find a place that contained so much information. At this moment, the eater thought that there was only a small chance of finding Reny here. However, there was no certainty that she had gone to Haston, so it was definitely worth holding back here. Immediately after asking again about the object of the search, Melja smiled and said that the guy could take it easy, and she would go on the search with him. The eater noted that this would not be an easy job for the demon queen. Then he asked if the girl was afraid that something would happen to her fortress. The interviewee replied that she was pleased to be so worried about her, but there was really nothing to worry about. Melja explained that as a demon queen, she is a supreme creature that was born to rule. For creatures such as her, the very location itself is demon territory. The shadow army controlled by the queen is also ready to come to the rescue at any second. Summarizing everything that the interlocutor said, the guy realized that the girl could call upon the power of her subordinate demons at any time and at her own will. Melja confirmed, but added that she had never tried anything like this before. That finally shattered the Eater's confidence in his companion. Seeing the guy's disappointed reaction, the girl chimed in that her father had done this in the past, so she was sure she could do it too. Time after time trying to justify herself, Melja said she had no other choice, for the castle her father had passed down to her was already half destroyed, and there was little she could do about it. No sooner had the Eater said words of condolence than the girl shouted at the top of her voice that even she was having a hard time with the human capital right in front of the castle. A few seconds later, she gathered her thoughts and said it was time to leave the depressing talk aside and start gathering information. After saying that, Melja ran straight down the street. The Eater followed her. At that moment, he had a strong premonition that there would only be more problems. However, he sincerely hoped that it was just bad thoughts. A while later, 2 large mugs of beer rumbled down on the table in front of the protagonist. The boy stared at the beverage he had brought. The feeling that everything would not go according to plan was confirmed. At the same time, Melji pounced greedily on the alcohol. The Eater wanted to ask why they were here when they were still so far from their destination. However, the girl immediately pulled the mug away from her mouth and shrieked contentedly. Wiping her chin, the demoness said that the guy didn't seem to know much about human settlements. She explained that the bars were where all the information flowed. Then the girl pointed with her hand in the direction. The place was full of people having a good time and drinking. Melja said that all they had to do was look around and listen. She explained that all the conversations here can be compared to uncut diamonds. All they have to do is sit and listen. The girl laughed and said that all they had to do now was to enjoy themselves and, in parallel, tease out the information they needed. Realizing the full extent of what was happening, the Eater looked around and tried to listen. Suddenly, the main character's attention is drawn to a strange object in the corner of the bar. He saw that a lot of people were crowded together near a wall on which some papers had been nailed. Noticing this, Melja immediately jumped up and ran over to the board. She was surprised that the thing was here, too. The girl explained that even more information could be stored in similar corners. People can post various contracts and assignments here. Ripper's attention was drawn to a pamphlet with the names of the members of the Dungeon Raid Squad. Melju said she'd heard of such lists being used to stop disagreements between different squads about to go to the same dungeon. The girl explained that usually, when situations like this happened, people had problems with their rewards. The Eater grinned and remembered a few similar situations where several squads had broken into his place at the same time. At the same moment, Melja called the men pathetic. In her opinion, if they gathered in larger units and attacked together, the chances of victory would increase many times over. Snapping her fingers, the demoness compared such raids to trying to burst into flames for the sake of mythical hope. To this, the Eater replied that it was the same outcome that made it easier for them. After he said that, he saw that the girl was looking at him intently. The hero realized that he himself had given the demoness an excuse to easily figure him out. Melja asked her interlocutor if he was also a dungeon demon. The boy remained silent and couldn't answer anything. He turned and saw his companion looking at him with a frantic stare. The girl muttered that she had originally suspected something wrong. After all, while she, as a demon queen, could move around the surface safely, Sir Demda, as a mere monster, could not leave the dungeon. A few seconds later, Melja suddenly stepped aside and said that she wouldn't ask about it again, because surely the guy had reasons for withholding this information. The protagonist then looked at the bulletin board again and saw a very familiar piece of paper. Visually, this announcement didn't stand out much from the rest, while the name of the dungeon in question immediately caught the Eater's attention. It was about his house. There was no date given for the start of the raid. Besides, the squad sheet was completely empty. The boy thought that he should have enough time to complete the task. Suddenly, Melja yanked his arm and asked him what he was looking at. The guy ignored the interlocutor, assuming that he could reveal his true identity. The girl didn't stop, and she started pulling the hero by his sleeves, demanding to show the paper. The Eater was tired of dealing with Melji acting like a child. So at some point, he gave up and showed the sheet. The girl saw that she was holding a recruitment ad for a squad to raid one of the 7 great dungeons called the Core of Primordiality. The Eater asked his partner if she had ever heard of this place. The girl replied that every monster knows about it. The demoness took the sheet and headed toward the table. One marveled that even stupid humans recognized that the 7 dungeons of great evil were the best of their kind. Looking enthusiastically at the name of the raid, Melja plumped down in her chair and said that every demon aspired to make it to the seven. She then smiled and said that even among the seven great dungeons, there was one who was the peak of all peaks. This is the being who rules the core of the primordial universe. He is the supreme king of all things, the protector of the god who punishes those who shake with fear. After these words, the girl's eyes shone again, and she said that the oldest monster standing at the top of the universe was Mr. Ripper. The idol standing behind her was not happy about this fame. Looking at the mug of beer in his hands, the boy thought that now he looked more like a landowner than a real ruler. What to say if he was being told off even by his own subordinates? At this point, Melia explained that all her excitement for this dungeon was due to the fact that she liked it the best. After saying that, the girl leaned on her arm sadly and mouthed that if she could ever become stronger, she would definitely get an audience with Mr. Eater. The guy smiled uncertainly in response. It would be both funny and strange if this idiot recognized who was sitting right in front of her. Looking at the almost unemptied mug of beer, the girl said that having a power that no one could match was very cool. She sighed and said that she really wanted to be just like the Devourer. Melia then remembered that her father had also been very strong and, unlike her, had been a king worthy of his throne. However, even in his time there were people who were stronger. She added that her father had been defeated by some young hero named Vern. The Eater pretended to be surprised by this fact and added that he wouldn't want to meet someone so powerful, though she had actually swallowed Vern a few days ago when the guy had just yawned. At this moment, the girl's face grew sad. Melja said that she didn't want to spend her life running the dungeon like her father did. Suddenly, she spread her arms out to the sides and mouthed that she wanted to become so strong that demons would be attracted to her might. The demoness smiled and said that was what she was trying for. The girl then asked her partner what he thought about her ideals. The Eater grinned and replied that it sounded very cool. He thought at that moment that he had encountered roughly the same thoughts in his youth. Overwhelmed with enthusiasm, the Eater introduced a mighty army that could take over half the world. It was so long ago that now the guy doesn't even remember the details. Then, in order to comprehend all the mysteries of the universe, he had to cooperate with the people he hated so much. At some point, however, the Eater was consumed by emotion and gave people everything he had. At the same time, when it was over, he learned that everything he had done was pointless. That was why laziness became the new goal in the Eater's life. Afterward, the protagonist came back from his memories and saw that his partner was already asleep. He hoped to the end that the girl was about to get up, but it looked like she had passed out intentionally. A while later, when both heroes had left, a bartender came out into the hall to join the people. In his hand was a new sheet with a task. After the bartender explained that he had forgotten to put up the notice yesterday, many in the audience started talking about how it was impossible to publicize yesterday's assignment just now. However, the bartender began nailing the sheet to the wall without any questions, saying that everyone who wished to do so could now consider a new assignment. Someone in the crowd tried to warn the man, saying that Imperial inspectors could catch and fine the bartender for posting the announcements. However, after saying that he would get nothing for it, many people came over to see what the paper was about. The paper talked about a raid on the primordial core. Similar to the information Pedric had received, the attack was to take place within 3 days after the decree was published. The next morning for the heroes began in one of the capital's hotels. Melia tried to move with great difficulty. Waking up and getting out of bed, the girl said her head was just splitting. Almost immediately, a yawning Eater appeared on the doorstep of the room. The girl began to justify herself to her partner, saying that she didn't remember what had happened yesterday. The guy tried to say that it was natural, but then when he raised his head to his interlocutor, his body trembled. From surprise, the protagonist fell to the ground and looked fearfully at Melja. The girl asked in bewilderment that why Sir Demda was so much surprised. The boy looked straight ahead and couldn't believe his eyes. For a second, the Eater thought his eyesight had just gone bad. A girl of diminutive size was sitting on the bed in front of him. She didn't look like the Melja he'd been out with yesterday. The guy called the girl low, and she immediately jumped on him with fists, saying he was using too harsh words. As the demoness struck one blow after another, the Devourer nonchalantly asked her why she had grown up so suddenly. The pretty girl replied that she hadn't gotten any younger. Her age has remained the same. Without stopping beating her partner, Melji explained that yesterday the guy had seen the so-called second form. She's in this form, and the nasty people don't look down on her. The companion then explained that the current look was her first form. After listening to the interlocutor, the Eater asked the logical question, Was the current guise the one that was the basic correct form? The girl automatically agreed, and then shrieked that the guy was confusing her, and everything was wrong. Then Melda asked the protagonist what happened to his face. Was it swollen after eating the night's goodies? Receiving only a soft chuckle in response, the girl said seriously again that in any case, transformation magic usually projected the future form of the one applying it. In other words, she will indeed sooner or later become as beautiful as she appears to people in her second form. In fact, she just needs to grow up. The girl then pointed her finger excitedly at the protagonist and asked if he understood all of the above. The eater nodded his head tiredly. Such a lukewarm response infuriated Melja, and she shouted in rage. Was he not satisfied with her answer? The guy said it would be a good idea for her to change her clothes first. At the same time, intriguing events were taking place in Haston village. It was quiet and peaceful all day outside the Count's residence. Suddenly, the rumble of horses' hooves sounded not far from the manor. A large and heavily armed group of men in armor summoned Count Haston to negotiate. The man leading the raiding party ordered the gate to be opened and led his squad into the village. He explained that his boys had traveled a very long way from the capital to finish off the primordial core once and for all. Meanwhile, inside the manor itself, the Earl was reading a letter that had arrived last night. This declaration was signed by the Third Eye. After reading the message to the end, Etark crumpled the paper in rage, complaining that those damned knaves from the royal community had already gotten to him. The Earl then slapped his hand on the table and shouted that entering a dungeon of rank B and above required the permission of the Lord with jurisdiction in the land. But what he received clearly smelled like an order. Gritting his teeth, the nobleman realized that he could not even refuse this order, for it was signed by the king himself. Turning to the maid standing behind him, Etark asked if she believed that the squad would absolutely succeed in attacking the primordial core. The girl turned her head away sadly and looked down at the floor. Her reaction made the situation clear. The Count realized that they were both fast in the same way. Even these guys are too weak for this place. Besides, no one here has ever heard of a new leader named Nifrim. It seemed that no one but the Third Eye knew the real purpose of this operation. If these brats were just fooling around with the core, it would be the Haston region that would be in big trouble. Suddenly, a new idea popped into Etark's head. What if we send a stronger raid into the dungeon first? However, that would require a legitimate squad. Seeing that the Count was in thought, the maid turned to him and said that perhaps the answer was closer than he thought. The man immediately stirred and realized what his companion was talking about. She was referring to the Mage Tower and the Wing organization. Moreover, according to numerous rumors, many high-quality artifacts of unknown origin had recently fallen under the Wing's control. Even so, this idea was unlikely to succeed. However, it was worth a try. If the Pass Squad managed to defeat Fear, in that case, the only monster left at the muddy crossroads should be the Eater. After these thoughts, Etark ordered to send someone to the Wing at once and make inquiries. The Count swore by his name that he would promise a huge sum of gold and great honor if the problem with the core was solved. Suddenly, however, the door to the study rattled open. The maid and the governor looked at the intruders in bewilderment, asking who were they. A man with white hair entered ahead of the group of knights and asked if he was really dealing with Count Etark. The governor confirmed his status and asked the young man to identify himself. The boy said his name was Nifrim. He explained that the Count refused to open the door no matter how many times he was called. After that, the lad apologized for the intrusion. The governor asked the bold young man what had brought them here. Nifrim replied that the royal family had informed the Earl. The unknown man then looked angrily at Etark and asked if he had found reasons why they shouldn't be here. The Count replied that he accepted the king's decision. Nevertheless, he thought to himself that this young lad had an incredible thirst for murder. The girl with green eyes who sat down next to them said that they were just guests here and asked everyone to smile. Then she said that she wanted some sweets and ordered to bring chocolate and candy. The Count hesitated for a few seconds, shocked at such audacity. However, he then laughed and ordered the maid to go and fetch whatever the guest demanded. After the food had been brought in, the two men sat down opposite each other. Etark asked the guests what had brought them here. Nifrim replied that they were here to destroy the core of primordiality, of course. The governor grinned and said that it had only been a day since the letter was written, and the group had arrived very quickly. He then asked when the raid was going to take place. Nifrim explained that they had planned to move out today, but there were unforeseen circumstances. After saying that, he asked the Count if it would be a problem for him if the Third Eye Squad left here tomorrow. Etark replied that even tomorrow would probably be badly out of time. He explained that the task was important, so surely Nifrim and his men had better recover their strength and only then go. In return, his lands would guarantee lodging and hospitality. But suddenly Nifrim interrupted him and said that he shouldn't give them so much honor. The boy said that they would stop at the Mage's Tower and leave at once. The Count's plans were completely disrupted by this turn of events. He asked irritably, "Do the thugs know anyone there?" Nifrim sighed heavily and said he did. However, the reason for introductions was not so friendly. Suddenly, the blonde guy blurted out that they were going there to interrupt everyone there. The shocked Count could not get a word out of himself for some time. Then he asked his interlocutor what he meant. Nifrim smiled and said that the defenses in the governor's house were too weak, and it was extremely easy to eavesdrop on him with magic. The blonde guy then turned to Etark and said that he had heard the whole plan on the way here. While the shocked Count couldn't get a single word out of himself, the raider said that they didn't come all the way here just to give the dungeon to someone. Therefore, his guys are ready to do anything to get rid of those who get in their way. The guy then looked at his opponent and said that he was also in a winning position. Otherwise, the one who is stronger will take the colonel. By this time, Etark was afraid to even look Nifrim in the eye. He turned away, apologized for his words, and vowed not to hire anyone else. The green-haired raider who had been silent until then took the food and said they would. Taking a bite of the cookie, she muttered that she was terribly pleased with the Count's graciousness. Meanwhile, Pedric practiced on homemade puppets in the cave. At one point, he stopped and looked around and mouthed that the time was almost upon him and they would be coming for him soon. Meanwhile, the Eater, along with Melji, were pacing the city. A few dozen city blocks away, the travelers came upon a massive city wall that separated one neighborhood from another. Looking at the high passageway, the girl said the teleporter must be here. The hero decided to find out more information from the nearest person he met. He turned to some knight and said that he needed to go to the teleportation center. Unexpectedly, the warrior said that he would have to go straight for some more time. This surprised the Eater greatly, and he asked again, "Did they really have to drive somewhere?" The knight said that the teleportation center is outside the royal palace, so they need to keep moving forward. To do this, travelers will have to pass 3 more fortress walls. This arrangement was beginning to stress the guy out a little. He asked irritably how long it would take them to get there. The warrior thought for a moment, and after a few seconds replied that if the travelers were going to walk, the journey would take them at least a week. Such information shocked both heroes. They had expected a long journey, but not one that would take so long. The Eater thought it would be too long. At this rate, not only would he not be able to find Reny, but even Pedric would escape from the dungeon. Suddenly, the companion looked at the guy enigmatically and asked if he was thinking about the magic of flight. The protagonist misspoke when he said that if they used mana for too long, people would catch them. In fact, he didn't want to do that because he didn't know what would happen. Suddenly, an unfamiliar voice called out to the travelers. Some man said that the boys must be in trouble. It turned out to be an old man who looked like a local merchant. He apologized for overhearing the conversation between the travelers. After a question from Melji as to who they were dealing with, the old man introduced himself, calling himself a divine rider named Belbeer. After that, the girl opened her mouth wide and stared at the old man, making him a little embarrassed. Getting to the point, Belbeer said he had a homunculus created through alchemy. The creature named Zephyr is a 4th-generation monster that has been gotten rid of. It is the product of an imperial plan to create artificial humans. The protagonist did not experience any emotion after what was said. However, Melji showed squeamishness and looked at the creature with distrust. The rider petted the pet and said that it was a very strong, good at listening to commands, and able to fly homunculus. However, this monster was unable to fulfill its original purpose of bringing about the fall of the church and state. Melja asked if people stopped homunculi after these failed experiments. The old man replied that they had not. It was logical to recognize that the Empire would never ignore such a power. Now there are even rumors that somewhere they have begun to mass-produce homunculi on an industrial scale. Such a statement struck the Eater as a bit odd, and he asked, "Aren't these creatures grown in large cylinders?" The divine rider marveled at how outdated the young man's knowledge was. He explained that this method of cultivation had been used for the first generation of homunculi 150 years ago. The boy listened carefully to these words. He could not believe that so much time had already passed. At the same time, he now knew Reny's approximate age. While the protagonist was in thought, Melja walked over to the carriage to inspect it. Everything looked pretty good. It looked like the old man really wasn't lying. After asking about the length of the journey, Belbeer said that the standard route was 3 hours in the air and 1 hour at the checkpoint. Even though they would fly, it would still be necessary to pass the checkpoint at the castle gates. The eater then asked how much the trip would cost. The old man smiled and said it would cost 8 ounces of gold coins for both of them. The travelers were horrified at this high price tag. The price offered was 800 ounces of silver. They were able to rent the most ordinary room in the pub for 100 times less. Melja apologized to Sir Demdy and said she didn't have that much money. The boy went through his pockets and said he didn't have anything like that either. But suddenly, as the protagonist was tapping himself in his pockets, something in his cloak made a loud clinking sound. He slipped his hand into his pocket and pulled out a bundle. He'd never taken anything like this with him on a hike. Unwrapping the wrapper, the eater couldn't believe his eyes. It contained a few gold coins and a plaque with a message from Pedric, who wrote that the crooked boss would one day be grateful to him. After a while, the two travelers were already flying over the city blocks towards the center. Contemplating the streets whizzing by beneath her feet, Melja asked her partner who had given him such money. The guy yawned and lazily replied that his dungeon partner had slipped it to him before he left. These words once again confirmed that Sir Demd is a dungeon monster. The girl asked how the boy was able to move freely. The protagonist replied that in this situation, it would probably be more accurate to say that he was chased away. When she heard that, she asked if the monster the boy was looking for had been chased away. The eater replied that in a way it was. Melja pressed her lips together and said she envied the fact that even after leaving the dungeon, Sir Demda worried about his partner to the very end. She wished she had one too. The girl said with a smile that it's incredible when someone cares about you and you care about others. Sometime later, the heroes reached a neighborhood called the Way of Gold and Pleasure. However, to the travelers' greatest dismay, the teleporter was disabled. The boy asked the warder standing in the row if they would be able to use the machine anytime soon. The man in the cassock first apologized for the inconvenience. Melja sighed frustratedly and said that she had assumed that would be the case. The mage explained that the teleporter would reopen at 8 o'clock in the evening. All sessions are suspended until that time to ensure the auction is safe. Guests of honor will want to use the teleporter after the event is over, so permission will be given to use it. The guy took the brochure he was handed, surprised that such a machine had been stopped for some kind of auction. The guard explained that this time there would be a rather rare item for sale. The mage explained that a few days ago, they had a brachycephalic tooth whose whereabouts had been unknown for a long time. Therefore, such precautions were necessary to prevent people from teleporting into the auction site. The drawing was very much to the traveler's liking. At the same time, the Devourer was reminded of something very strongly. But suddenly he felt uneasy. The boy realized that this was exactly the kind of blade Reny had used. It was the thing her partner used, he said. The excited mage asked the strange man if he was sure. The eater replied that it was absolutely definitely that blade. As proof, he said that the thing whistled when drawn and could also turn into a large sword. After the guard said again that it was probably some kind of mistake, the protagonist looked at him angrily and said that his partner was wearing clothes without pockets in which to hide a weapon. This sword is the only one of its kind in the world. Suddenly, the eater didn't feel good. He was gradually losing control of his body. There was no doubt now that it was Reny's weapon. The boy's mind began to waver in numerous contradictions. He didn't understand how this blade had ended up in people's possession. In favor of the version that denied the worst outcome was the fact that Reny, even bosses from other great dungeons, couldn't just defeat her. As for ordinary people, they would never be able to fight her. The eater tried to convince himself that his partner wasn't simply nicknamed the Handmaiden with the blade. But the question remained, had Reny been armed when she'd escaped from the dungeon? She was wearing loose clothing without any pockets where weapons could be hidden. Reny threw one of her blades at the guy when he mistook her for an enemy. In favor of the worst version was the fact that the girl had never fought people with less than 5 blades. In addition, Pedric was Selenius, even without his sword. But Reny was not like that at all. Meanwhile, Melja stood fearfully to the side and watched as the eater began an uncontrollable release of energy. The guy was furious at the realization that a great monster like Reny had been defeated by some mere humans. His energy slowly began to spread throughout the room. The guard huddled fearfully in the corner, not realizing what was happening. When the dark matter came close to his face, the mage screamed exhaustedly, ordering the monster to move away from him. The eater, however, snapped the poor man's neck in one easy motion. He thought that if Reny hadn't really died at the hands of the humans, it would be easier to kill them all. His gaze at that moment was filled with madness. He didn't hear what Manhwa was trying to shout at him. Realizing that it wasn't going to be that easy for him to shout, the girl grabbed her partner's sleeve. She pressed the guy to answer what had happened. Guy asked his companion about the bracephalic tooth. He was interested in whether this masterpiece was really present in only one copy. The girl sadly replied that to her knowledge, this was indeed the case. Manhwa then asked what had happened. The protagonist explained that the item belonged to his partner, and he needed to return the blade. After saying that, the eater lashed out, saying that the girl didn't have to help him, and he was already grateful for everything she had done for him. The demoness tried to stop the guy, but he said that he now knew how to get to Haston, so he should go on alone from here. At that moment, his aura intensified again. The eater said that it was best for Manhwa to leave this place soon if she wanted to stay alive. At that moment, the girl realized that she had no choice but to reveal her cards. When the guy stopped, Manhwa said that she knows about a dungeon monster that is a girl with silver hair and can use masterpieces as weapons. After a short pause, the girl said that the creature's name was Miss Reny, nicknamed Maid, with a blade. Seeing the interlocutor tense up at that moment, Manhwa smiled and said that judging from his reaction, it was true. However, the guy was furious and said that he should not be provoked. The protagonist said that he was stressed by the girl's diligence in trying to learn more and more about him, but the demoness said that there was no need for her interlocutor to tell her anything about herself. For even if he spoke to her in such an intimidating tone, intimidation didn't work on her. After saying that, Manhwa's eyes lit up and she said that she had long ago realized who she was dealing with. Miss Reny is a page of the great core of primordiality. She is most certainly a supreme being. There is only one monster in the entire world who could call Miss Reny her partner. After that, the girl shouted happily that it could only be the great Lord Eater, the master of the primordial core. To the boy's surprise, those words calmed him down a lot. He exhaled and was about to admit that he was indeed a reaver. However, the girl's stupidity exceeded all his expectations. Before the protagonist could say anything, Manhwa immediately mouthed happily that she immediately realized that the eater was Sir Demda's boss. At that moment, the guy tried his best to keep a smile on his face. But inside, he wanted to howl with despair. The girl did not stop laughing, saying that she immediately realized all this just by looking at the face of the interlocutor. Then she also asked the guy not to get upset. It was just that her deduction exceeded any expectations. Besides, Manhwa now knows how dangerous the thoughts in Sir Demda's head are. So she is ready to help him and will not accept any objections. The protagonist continued to be in complete shock. He asked if the demon kings were always guided by such simple logic. The girl grinned and said that logical monsters will never become demon kings. Conversely, said Demon King becomes logical. After that, the guy snickered again, realizing that demon kings were very impulsive. Suddenly, Manhwa smiled and said that she could now see from the lad's condition that the old Sir Demda had returned. Now, when the interlocutor finally came to his senses, the girl was able to dump all the accumulated negativity on him. She explained that in some moments, she was really scared, because the guy said terrible things. Therefore, the demoness was glad that Mr. Demde was back to normal. She promised that she would look after him from now on. She then grabbed the eater's hand and asked him to promise that he wouldn't speak to her in that dreadful voice again. Meanwhile, on the day of the auction, the upper classes gathered in one of the city's most luxurious homes. One of the guards patrolling the main entrance leaned boredly against the fence. The distribution of the pamphlet had not caused such a stir in the city, which was to be expected. While the warrior was trying to figure out what the point of protecting a few rich aristocrats was, someone approached him from the side and said hello. A lady of unimaginable beauty stood right in front of the guard. She said in a commanding voice that she had come to participate in the auction and asked where she could enter. Right behind her stood some guy of unattractive appearance. Stammering slightly, the guard said they could go right through here, but he needed to know the names of the guests before entering. The woman said directly that her name was Manhwa from the Agreya family, and right behind her was her companion named Demdi, and Knight opened the list and tried to find a similar last name. But then he said in surprise that such a name was not on the guest list today. The girl covered her mouth with her hand and laughed, saying that there was no such thing. Then she turned around and asked her companion if he had brought an invitation with him. This surprised the guard very much. The strange type came closer to the knight, saying that he had taken everything. At that moment, the guard muttered that there were no invitations to this auction. However, before he could finish that sentence, the eater immediately knocked his opponent out with a powerful fist punch to the face. Lastly, he looked into the victim's eyes and said that they only had an invitation to the afterlife. Turning around, the eater asked if her companion could change her appearance. Melja replied that she didn't see the point. She asked snidely, wondering if the boy could resist her beautiful face. After the protagonist said that the girl was just a child, the interlocutor boiled up and ordered the guy to take back his words. Thus, the travelers easily passed into the main hall. At the same time, an oppressive atmosphere reigned in Chaktitsa Castle. Reny lay on the bed and stared at one point. Tears flowed from the homunculus's eyes, as she mouthed that Reny would never be able to return to the primordial core again. A memory from 80 years ago flashed through her mind. She saw the forest of Graphenia burning for days in a vast area. That night, a strange male voice pitied the owner of this place. No one could have imagined that people would do something like that. Yet this unknown man truly believed that the forest would recover and be happy again. Right in front of him sat a monster with swamp-colored hair. It was the earth fairy Graphenia, known as the Named Witch. She was staring at the human head in her hands with anger. This old woman has used the forest as her base for years. Now she's lost it. The boy looked around at the corpses lying around. All the people who had organized this mayhem were now dead. For the time being, Graphenia's rage should subside a little. However, one girl somehow miraculously survived amidst all that sea of blood. Apparently, she was also not involved in the burning of the forest. It was a creature that looked like a girl about 10 years old. This non-human life form created by humans is called a homunculus. There were two possible outcomes at that moment. The most likely and most logical of them was not to leave a witness to the atrocities. However, the guy suddenly turned to the defenseless girl. He said that he heard her owner's words before he died. That type said that the homunculus was now free and could leave. After these words, the strange monster walked over to the grate and grasped it with his hands. The guy said that the words of its past owner did not mean that he would help the girl get out of here. Nevertheless, he ripped the metal cage to shreds in one sharp motion. The creature reminded him that if the homunculus was trapped, it would be torn apart by wild beasts. The girl looked at her savior in surprise. The boy said that now she was free. Lastly, he reminded her that her name was probably Rello, as the last owner had called exhaustedly for some servant with that name before he died. Then the body of the unknown being dissolved. At last, the unknown being said that the mercy he had shown up to that point was over. After everyone else had left, Rello was left alone among the many corpses of people. She stared sadly at the ground and repeated her name over and over again. All around the girl was nothing but rubble. With difficulty overpowering himself, the homunculus climbed over the bars looking around. In fact, Rello was the name of a servant who reported to the head of the household. It was a middle-aged servant girl. In turn, homunculi cannot be called by names, for, like ordinary objects, these beings have no opinion of their own, nor do they have a name of their own. However, now the lonely girl had to learn to live alone in this huge, cruel world. Now Reny was alone again. She sat in front of the main building and looked sadly into the distance. At that moment, a female voice called out to her from behind. Elizabeth said that the conquering army sent by the Empire was heading towards the primordial core. After a short silence, Reny replied that even if Miss Bathory ordered her to go there, she still couldn't do it. Elizabeth replied that she was in no way forcing her friend to go there. On the contrary, she valued her personal happiness and Reny's freedom of choice. However, the vampiress feels that something should be done about the situation after all. She explained that if it was about those two, they had probably already scoured the entire continent looking for the girl. When the eater found out what had happened to Reny, a terrible thing could happen. Bathory explained to her friend that these two could just wipe out not only humanity, but anyone else they could get their hands on. However, immediately after that, Elizabeth changed her rhetoric, saying that the girl could stay here if she wanted. Pedric would take care of everything anyway, and the primordial core should be at the ready. For a brief silence, Bathory looked at the homunculus and said that if the girl wanted to put an end to everything, now was the best time. Reny sat there crumpling her dress uncertainly. But suddenly she turned to her friend. Standing up to her full height, the girl said she wanted to go for a walk. Elizabeth looked at her friend and noted that her right eye was getting worse. Miss Bathory offered to go for a walk with her. However, Reny looked at her interlocutor with eyes full of mad determination and said she was fine. Then the girl asked where her blades were. Meanwhile, the Eater and Melja were walking through the corridors of the auction house without resistance. The boy stopped a guard on the way and asked him what he knew about the brachycephalic tooth. The man gritted his teeth and said that he had been handed over by the Haston Tower of Mages. Then he begged to be released, for he knew nothing more. The protagonist wondered if Wing was really involved again. He thought to himself that all roads lead to Haston again. After an affirmative answer, the guy let the guard go and thanked him for the information, saying that he could live now. Turning around, the two monsters serenely headed further towards the main hall. The guard tried to catch his breath, holding his throat. He whispered that he'd almost died because of those bastards, even though he'd done nothing wrong to those things. But suddenly, right after those words, the monster appeared right next to the man. The demon grinned at the man's last words. The protagonist agreed that the man had done nothing wrong to him. However, he was just unlucky enough to get in the monster's way. Only at that moment did the guard finally realize that he was dealing with a demon. Meanwhile, the protagonist was talking about how people entering the dungeons never referred to what was happening as a massacre or slaughter. On the contrary, at different levels it is called subjugation or strategy. The Eater looked fiercely into the eyes of the terrified human and asked if he really thought the monsters that died for nothing deserved it. Squinting his eyes, the protagonist answered his own question. He said that not all monsters died for doing wrong. Therefore, demons like him would do the same. Because monsters and humans are enemies. Meanwhile, in the main hall, the most heated phase of the bidding was taking place. At one point, the highest bid was 7 million. Around this figure, the bidding stopped. Few people were willing to give a larger sum. Two girls standing on the sidelines were talking about what was going on. One of them offered to throw in a few fake bets for fun. Her companion replied that they were here as guards, not clowns. Win Historia, an officer of the Order of the Knights of the Black Wolf, waved at her friend, saying she couldn't manage to hang around her. Garrett, who held a similar position in the same clan, reminded her companion of their shared mission. The auctioneer put his hand up and asked if there were any more bids. After a silence, he said that in that case they had better finish soon and eat something quicker. The man then announced that number 3 was the winner. After that, he offered to end the auction. But suddenly, a non-human voice behind his back asked, "Why the permission to end the event?" The next instant, a sharp scream and splattered blood filled the presenter's podium. An unknown dark entity descended on the stage. The monster pierced the auctioneer with its tentacles and said that it would decide when the event was over. The Black Wolf officers appeared frightened and confused. This was nothing like they had planned to encounter. The majestic demon said that it was his understanding that everyone in this room wanted to redeem the brachycephalic tooth in one way or another. By that point, there were only 3 warriors in the Empire. After one of them, General Vern Hishutalt, was killed by the core of primordiality. He was blamed for his own demise because he prioritized conquest for enrichment. As a consequence of the promoted rhetoric, the other warriors were also criticized. Moreover, it was no longer possible to direct all the hatred at the dead Vern. Now it was up to one warrior named Win to regain the trust of the humans while keeping her survival instincts in check and burning with determination. The girl was terribly scared because she realized that she had no chance. She was terrified because she realized that she had no chance. But at the same second, she was grabbed by Garrett. She looked at her partner with the same frightened eyes and said they couldn't. The girl then looked at the monster on the stage again and said that they weren't leaving here. This terrifying man was too dangerous even for them. The protagonist, still holding the auctioneer in one of his tentacles, slowly paced the stage in the direction of the artifact. Upon reaching the flask containing the item being traded, the guy chuckled and said that he wasn't sure before. But now it was obviously true. The Eater thought that Reny's aura emanating from this artifact was too strong to claim that this one was a fake. With a light motion of his hand, he swept the flask aside. Everything in the circle indicated that neither Reny nor the humans were changing. The protagonist picked up the masterpiece and showed it to the audience. He said that it would be slightly problematic for him to explain the situation. The Eater explained that the item had had an owner for a long time. He muttered that he would have to put the artifact back where it belonged. The guy also realized that people were excited and were placing bets. Immediately after the explanation, he apologized for what had happened. But suddenly, there were angry shouts in the crowd. Some of the toffs were calling for the guards to arrest the impertinent man. Seeing that the wretched creatures weren't going to let him off that easily, the eater said he was of roughly the same opinion. Glaring angrily at the gathered people, he muttered that he would tear them all to pieces and bury them under the rubble of this building. But suddenly, an unknown person swept over the heads of the spectators at high speed, shouting that she wouldn't let it happen. That annoying voice almost took the protagonist by surprise. Looking straight in front of him, he saw an unknown girl approaching him from above. The distinctive feature of this girl was the huge iron gloves. The guy thought this hottie looked like a flying squirrel. She had decent movement, backed up by good equipment. However, the girl was still too clumsy. With that thought, the eater took a step to the side, and the opponent flew past in bewilderment. After examining the person from all angles, the protagonist determined that she had nothing but those gloves. In that case, in order to disarm her, you just have to break her arms. After studying his opponent's movement style, the guy decided that the girl moved pretty well after all. At the same second, Win activated her gloves and prepared to deliver a charged blow. The demon tried to block this attack, seeing little danger in it. The hands of man and beast clashed at high speed. It seemed like a tug of war was about to begin, and the girl wouldn't stand a chance. However, the eater did not expect the force of this blow to be so great. In the next instant, his body flew backward at great speed and slammed into one of the walls of the building. Wing was still standing in a fighting stance. In just a few seconds of fighting, her body had sweated terribly. The girl had expended a lot of energy and was trying to catch her breath. She was sure she was done with the monster. But suddenly, streams of dark matter caught her attention. Soon, all that energy merged together, and right in the cloud of dust in front of her, that monster reappeared. Win didn't understand how one could survive such a blow. Any monsters she had fought before had died from a single blow from this glove. Even the bosses didn't stand a chance with this technique. Also, these gloves, called Apocalypse replicas, should be able to withstand the strongest damage at least 3 times, but just now they broke with one hit. Undoing the latch, the girl threw off her right glove. Then she looked at her opponent in horror. It was completely unclear what he was. It was clearly not human, but it was also an unusual monster. The demon turned his attention back to Win and smiled. The girl finally stopped realizing who she was dealing with. The type opposite smiled broadly and apologized for the broken glove. Then his body vanished, splitting into dozens of streams of dark matter. Now this terrifying avalanche pounced on the defenseless girl. Suddenly, a frightened Win was called from behind by a familiar voice. The warrior turned around and saw a companion approaching her friend at breakneck speed. Win screamed exhaustedly for Garrett to stay away from this place under no circumstances. However, the warrior seemed to have already made her choice and wasn't about to change it. After a while, the eater crossed paths with Melji again. The girl said confusedly that the boy had made her worry. Barely holding back tears, the demoness said that she thought the guy had no chance of survival. The protagonist said that he himself does not understand how he managed not to die in this fight. He immediately thought of the warrior with her huge metal fist. He remembered the warrior with her huge metal fist, a blow that no ordinary man could have made, even with such equipment. If she had struck directly at the heart, the eater might have reverted back to its basic form from fright. In that case, if the disguise had been revealed, they'd be in worse shape than ever. Pedric would probably have left no trace of him, but those two had to be dealt with first. The boy was surprised at how easily they had escaped. He had no idea that there would be 2 of these flying squirrels at once. The girl with the pink hair had done her best. She took out all the people while the other one was distracting attention to herself and created a layer of protective magic on her partner. All at the same time. The protagonist smiled and thought they were some of the few funny rivals he knew. Immediately after the battle ended, something rumbled in one of the city streets. People in the vicinity flocked to where the strange object had fallen to see what was going on. It turned out that it was a wounded girl who by some miracle survived. People immediately started calling for a doctor to help. At this point, Wing thought she was a warrior, and yet some nameless monster had blown her to smithereens. Piers helped the girl to her feet. Win wondered what had become of the auction people and if Garrett had survived. The girl called out quietly to her friend. Suddenly, a familiar voice said that if you called her so quietly, she was unlikely to hear. The warrior looked up and saw Garrett standing in front of her. Win was glad to the point of tears that her companion had managed to survive. Garrett crouched down in front of her partner and told her that she should thank her. If it hadn't been for the timely entry of a third person into the fight, Win would have been ready for burial. The crying girl wanted to say thank you, but then a horrifying picture caught her attention. Wynn discovered that Garrett had lost half of her right arm in the fight. Her partner, on the other hand, said there was no need to make a fuss about it. The blue-haired girl immediately rushed to hug her friend, shouting that she was unworthy to be called a warrior and apologizing for what had happened. However, Garrett immediately shouted, ordering the girl to stop her hysterics. Afterward, she wiped her friend's crying eyes. The girl explained that no one should see an imperial warrior crying like a baby. Leaning closer to her partner, Garrett said that losing one arm was a small price to pay, because what was most important was who their opponent was. The warrior said that this monster was an eater from the primordial core. Wynn's breath caught at this point. She looked at her partner confusedly and said in a shaky voice that she didn't believe in these jokes because there was no way such a monster could be here. Garrett said she didn't know why, however, she firmly believed that she did. She explained. Something the Black Scourge was an ancient monster, an eater. Plus, the creature had too many traces of Vern Hishutalt, and that was considering it had been less than a month since the last mention of that warrior. After making the arguments, Garrett said that the situation was now far more serious than they could have ever imagined. At this rate, even the very existence of the Empire is threatened. Wynn cried out in panic that if it really was an eater, they should fight back much more forcefully, for in the lands of men, they had a significant advantage. However, Garrett put a hand on her partner's shoulder and told her it was time to calm down, because they couldn't solve this problem on their own at the moment. They simply couldn't win this battle. The girl asked her friend not to make any rash decisions. First, they should hurry up and request support from the headquarters of the Dungeon Raiders Union. In addition, they needed to report the situation to the royal family. Afterward, Garrett used her healing to heal Wynn's wounds. She also explained that teleporting the two of them in her current state would be difficult. Pointing to the wound, the warrior said that this spell would not cure it completely. Garrett asked her not to try to follow her and just wait where she was. Wynn tried to object, saying that no one knew where the monster would go on its next rampage. Her partner replied that even so, she didn't need to leave the place. In the next instant, Garrett soared into the sky and vanished into space. Meanwhile, the Eater was still in the ruins of the auction house. He was thinking about his future plan of action. Boy, could he leave the fugitives and go to Haston? Or could he chase after them and get rid of the dangerous elements? In this state of uncertainty, he spent a very great deal of time. Gathering his thoughts, the protagonist thought that here he had completed his business, taking the brachycephalic tooth with him. Still, he shouldn't forget about his main goal. He needs to find Reny, or at least her corpse. Deciding he needed to move on, the Eater turned around and called out to his companion. The girl said that she understood everything, but her voice sounded very sad. The boy asked what had happened to her. Melia replied that it was fine, but it was very unconvincing. The protagonist repeated his question. However, this time he did so more insistently. The girl turned to her companion, saying that he was really very strong. She thought she had realized it back in the Demon King's fortress, but as time passed, Melia became more and more amazed by the guy's abilities. The demoness recalled that from the words of the protagonist, Lady Reny is his colleague, however, he looks much stronger than her. Melia was worried about this. She thought that either she had imagined something wrong, or she was simply underestimating Lady Reny's strength. After saying that, the girl raised her eyes and looked at the guy, asking who he was after all. The Eater exhaled and scratched the back of his head. He then suddenly punched his partner in the head with his fist and called her a dumbass. The guy looked at the upset girl and asked why she was getting upset about it. Eater said that to her he was just Sir Demda for now. The monster then promised that once it was over, he would be sure to tell her everything. Judging by her partner's shifting gaze, she was satisfied with what she had said. Then the Eater said it was about time for them to get out. Just then, he offered to show his ally the full power of the Demon King. In one deft movement, the girl threw off her cloak. After that, Melia took her second form again and prepared to show all her capabilities. In the next second, she raised her staff up and used the reconstruction ability. A huge beam of purple magic shot into the sky. A massive explosion erupted in the city, visible from all points. In some areas, ash instantly covered the sky, hiding the sun from human view. Wynn was also sitting where her friend had left her. She stared at the explosion confusedly, realizing that the epicenter was in the place where the auction had taken place. People were fleeing from the debris, flying in different directions. The houses of many of them were instantly destroyed. Wynn struggled to get to her feet. Now she had to make a decision about what to do in this situation. Garrett's words about not taking any action alone were still fresh in her mind. However, even out of a sense of duty and compassion, the girl could not watch lives being destroyed around her, and there was nothing she could do about it. Suddenly, someone grabbed the warrior's arm from behind. The frightened girl turned around. Right behind her was a child who was crying, saying that her daddy stayed in the side where the explosion happened. These words greatly motivated Win to disobey the order. Clenching her fist, she shouted to the people standing around her not to panic. Turning around towards the explosion, the girl said she would take care of everything. Warrior Win Historia was traveling alone to certain death out of a sense of civic duty. Not a single intact building remained within a huge radius of the epicenter of the blast. Suddenly, a man's foot emerged from under the rubble, kicking away chunks of crushed stone. It was an eater who was also covered in destroyed buildings. He gave his partner a disgruntled look and called out to her. The guy asked what the name of the magic she used was. Melja replied that it was reconstruction. It is an advanced ability that shudders the earth. The girl smiled and asked, "Wasn't that perfect?" The eater asked irritably. Didn't the companion have any other magic she could use in this situation? In response, Melja said that she shouldn't be blamed for every little thing. Besides, the guy was acting really cool when he told her to gather her thoughts, so she used the clearest magic she knew. Sitting down on the wreckage, the girl explained that if her partner wanted to complain about something, he'd better tell her what he wanted to see beforehand. The protagonist replied that he thought as if the girl knew what she was doing. Suddenly, the eater felt something large approaching. Things were only getting more confusing. Guy asked his partner if she remembered the way to the teleporter. Melja answered that she could easily find her way there. Then, the protagonist ordered the girl to go there first and protect him. After all, people would surely gather there to try to escape. In addition, Melja should prepare a teleporter to travel to Haston to go there right away. But before leaving, the girl asked her partner a question. She wondered what kind of village she had been talking about all this time, and where was this place even located? The boy turned around and asked in bewilderment, "Did Melja not know the coordinates of the primordial core?" The girl replied that she hadn't guessed it right away. She then remarked that she had said countless times that this was her favorite of all the dungeons. The protagonist interrupted her and said that Haston was the nearest village to the core, but the demoness immediately admitted that she had only seen this dungeon in books before. The eater once again realized that his ally was not the best, and asked the girl to go do her own thing. Melja immediately rushed towards the teleporter, saying that she would protect the device until the protagonist arrived. The eater stood alone among the rubble. The silence around him was more than suspicious. It seemed that even his dungeon wasn't that quiet at times. Suddenly, a sense of approaching danger told the lad that the opponents were already here. Looking to the side, he saw a huge horde of several dozen people. Suddenly, a male voice said that these fighters all belonged to the Langyori family, one of the 9 pillars of the empire. The Blue Crane Realization Squad appeared in front of the boy. The captain of the squad, a one-eyed blonde man with a mask over his face, asked the demon who he was. The protagonist thought that he didn't understand people at all at times like this, because every time they are completely lazy to show off. Once again, the eater's gut told him that there were too many people at the auction site. It seemed to be the personal army of a wealthy man. The demon turned to those present, asking why on earth he should reveal his name. After a brief tense silence, the eater went into battle mode and said that the wretched humans might just consider him their enemy. At the same time, the inside of the primordial core was turbulent. A woman's voice said that it was rumored that people who enter this place never return. Then someone told Nifrim that if he died, his soul would be enslaved and would wander the underworld forever. A girl named Sylvia was jumping behind the squad leader and shouting that they should probably go back out. However, the guy irritably ordered the girl to stop fooling around. The huntress looked sadly at the leader and wondered if she couldn't be entertained anymore. She accused Nifrim of being very boring. Suddenly, Sylvia noticed that this place they had come to looked very strange. In the first room, there were corpses of slain monsters lying everywhere. However, the current part of the dungeon was completely clean. The furnishings here looked like someone had cleaned up recently. Nifrim turned to the rest of the team to speak on the news as well. Various assumptions sprinkled through the crowd. The raiders realized that Hishutalt's squad wouldn't have cleaned up along the way. Few believed the monsters had such high intelligence. Just then, Nifrim remembered that this dungeon was rumored to have been cleaned out all the way to the 5th room. There shouldn't have been any monsters left here to clean up anytime soon. However, the question remained, Why would the monsters want to clean up the corpses in the first place? Suddenly, the leader felt something that made him instinctively turn around. Staring into the darkness, the boy shouted furiously for the unknown man to stop looking down on them and finish with his pathetic tricks. After these words, he saw two glowing eyes in the distance in the darkness. The screams echoed off the walls several times, and then the unknown man said that the guy's loud voice even made his bones vibrate. Nifrim instantly ordered Sylvia to light up the place. At the same time, it was explained from the front that the monster wasn't deceiving anyone, and he just didn't like seeing corpses around. So he cleaned up the place. I used a spell and directed it in the direction the voice came from. After the space was illuminated, the raiders saw a skeleton sitting in a not too far away from them. The monster said that the shabby guys tried hard to get here, but no one invited them. In that case, he added that he welcomed them to his lair. Nifrim looked at his opponent with some nervousness. He asked, wondering if he had to talk to a death knight named Pedric. In response, the skeleton said that he had prepared grandiose cheers, but it was all for nothing. He thanked the damned bastards for not being able to give the speech he had been thinking up all day because of them. Pedric then turned to the raiders and noted that they were clearly not an easy audience. The monster suggested that they calm down a bit and put their weapons away. He asked the sorceresses and martial artists to lower their staffs and fists. However, at the same second, Nifrim instantly lashed out at the creature, yelling for it to stop talking nonsense. The skeleton easily blocked this attack. He looked angrily at the human and said that they had no manners at all because they didn't even let him catch his breath. The squad leader moved a distance away and pounced again with another strike. This time, he used the ice shower ability. From the strength of this skill, the vaults of the cave shook and the floor collapsed. Nifrim struck one lightning-fast blow after another. He realized that he always goes through this, but it's hard to do it alone, even when a guy knows he's going to win. After a few more attempts to hit the monster, the opponents separated in different directions. Pedric raised his hand and snapped his fingers. A sword slammed into the ground behind him out of nowhere. The skeleton squinted his eyes and looked at his opponent. He thought that things were not developing as originally expected. The monster addressed Nifrim to him and said that the guy was very strong for a human. Raider had a huge amount of enhancements like strong body, banner reading, feathers of light, silent step, and boiling blood. Pedric reached for his weapon. He laughed and said it was absurd that the source of the kid's power was amplifying magic. Mentally, however, the monster wasn't so sure of his advantage. He knew that the duration of this enhancement was not that long, and he only needed to last for 1 minute. Suddenly, numerous reinforcement spells fell on the body of the leader of the human squad. From the look on Pedric's face, he was very surprised by this surprise. In the same second, the man ran up and knocked the core defender to the ground with his foot. Nifrim's aura emitted incredible power. He looked disdainfully at his opponent and ordered him not to open his mouth again. Otherwise, he would know who the winner really was. The pinned skeleton shook and said that wasn't bad. He added that he couldn't imagine that someone would ever be able to fell him like that with magic. Standing to the side, Sylvia didn't expect that it was already over. She whispered that even the defender of the primordial core wasn't that strong. With those words, she caught Pedric's attention. The skeleton said aloud that he had originally assumed that he had to get rid of the green-haired sorceress first. However, at this moment, Nifrim pinned his opponent to the ground even harder and ordered him to shut up. The guy looked at the helpless skeleton with hatred and swung his sword and said that it was time for that one to die. The raider struck with all his might at the center of his opponent's head. But suddenly, the monster used the tips of 2 fingers to intercept and stop the blade. A wild and long laugh came from downstairs. Pedric shouted that it had been a lot of fun, and this time he had really played his part to the full. The squad leader looked at his opponent in bewilderment. Meanwhile, the skeleton apologized for having to mock the humans, because he had become too bored over the past few years. Pedric explained that all he wanted to do was to get a sense of the complex danger. Then he looked angrily at the men and thanked them for making him laugh. Some time passed after these words. Nifrim, who was lying on the ground, suddenly woke up and greedily began to gulp air. Coming to his senses a little, he looked around and wondered what had just happened to him. Suddenly, an eerily familiar voice from outside rejoiced that the boy was finally awake. The leader of the sweep team looked warily to his left. There was a death knight standing in it like nothing had happened. The monster said that while the guy was out, he allowed himself to fix the situation. However, so as not to rant, the skeleton pointed behind his back and said that the squad leader could see for himself. Behind him lay the corpses of the rest of the cleanup team. Pedric said that so far, all the people he had encountered had failed to return home alive. The monster was surprised that people, knowing his name, still came here to try their luck. He asked if no one else knew anything about him. Nifrim answered nothing, and then the skeleton threw Sylvia's body at the squad leader's feet. He said that the green-haired sorceress was a bit difficult to deal with. Pedric complained that this weakling had used holy magic with area damage that still made the monster's bones itch. In any case, Pedric now knew that his last opponent's name was Nifrim. At least that was the name the sorceress shouted before she let out her last breath. As the raider leader sat staring at his friend's breathless body, the skeleton parodied her screams before she died. The creature said that the guy had no idea how much she was calling him at that moment, yet he never said anything back. Nevertheless, Nifrim never said a word. Pedric called his opponent boring and heartless and said he had hoped to punch him hard on the emotions. Taking out the human sword sticking out of his back, the monster said that now it was time for the survivor to answer questions. He knew that as stupid as Pemer was, he wouldn't send only 30 people here. Besides, their level was frankly below average. Bringing the blade of the blade to the boy's head, Pedric asked what the human was hiding from him. However, Nifrim didn't answer anything. The skeleton said that he was actually very friendly, so he could give the squad leader a choice. If the guy would answer questions, he should raise his right hand, otherwise his left. After a few hesitations, the blonde held out his right hand to his side. Pedric said it was a wise decision and promised that Nifrim would have the most painless death possible. However, then with the same right hand, the squad leader showed his opponent his middle finger. The skeleton laughed and said that it was the first time he had been held in such a manner. Pedric then raised his sword above his head and said that he respected Nifrim's choice, but would pray that his death would be long and painful. After that, a powerful thump was heard, and the cave was finally silent. The skeleton headed towards his lair, lamenting that there was still no way he could finish all this cleaning. Meanwhile, Nifrim's body was left standing in the same position in which it had been pierced. A distant voice added that the cleanup should go easier this time than last. However, the blond man was still alive. He lifted his head to make sure that the skeleton was finally gone. Then the boy looked sadly at his feet. Sylvia's breathless body lay in front of him. The squad leader bowed his head and barely held back the tears that were coming. He apologized to the girl for what had happened to her and what would happen to her body. However, as vile as he was, Nifrim had to live. With that thought, the boy opened his mouth, filled with sharp fangs. Then the sounds of flesh eating were heard. Pedric had been standing behind one of the walls the whole time. He thought that even his bones trembled at that sound. It was clear that there was no way people would have come here without a plan. The skeleton wondered what would happen if this thing kept eating corpses without end. Pedric was also very interested in how powerful the skill was and what its source was. In any case, the monster had to slowly check the situation, as there were quite a few corpses around. It was then that Pedric wondered what was happening to the boss now and where he was. The skeleton folded his hands in prayer and hoped the Lord wasn't doing strange things in equally strange places. Meanwhile, the Devourer effortlessly interrupted the squad that came up to kill him. In the same second, when Historia was on the scene, the guy noticed the stranger and looked back. He wondered if the girl had also come here to die. The warrior replied that it was not and stood up in a fighting stance and introduced herself. The eater said that he didn't ask anyone's name. He added that the last attempt was a good one, but the girl still couldn't beat him. However, these words did not stop Wing at all. She swung around to attack her opponent once again. The monster only stared at her strange impulses in bewilderment. In the next instant, the warrior swiftly pounced on the monster. Either way, she would have to try to stop this monster. However, this attempt was far more fatal than the situation at the auction house. The eater simply stopped the girl's hand with his palm. Approaching his rival closely, he said that the one she inflicted on him last time was only a one-time action. The guy then grabbed the warrior's arm and said that the girl could try to escape from here if she succeeded. But at the same second, the Devourer clenched Win's hand with such force that the girl's eyes darkened. Then he swung his rival's unconscious body around and slammed her to the ground. Splattering blood from her shattered mouth, the warrior once again realized she could not win, but she hoped she had bought at least a little time. The eater lifted his rival's weakened body, surprised that she had already given up. Suddenly, the girl opened her eyes and said that she couldn't just fall in this battle. In the same second, a new aura began to form near her hand. Win said that she wouldn't let a monster near the citizens of the Empire. The warrior concentrated all her remaining power into one single attack and swung around, screaming at full force. Her blow landed in the center of her opponent's chest, but did absolutely no damage at all. After that, the girl's arm finally weakened and fell down. The eater pulled back the hand of her weakened opponent and said that she would at least meet a dignified death. He then turned to Win and said he would remember her name, but it was unlikely to be for long. After these words, the eater raised his foot and said that in order to honor the defender, he would finish her painlessly. But suddenly, something at high speed flew into the back of the protagonist's head. The guy turned around and looked irritably behind his back. He saw that a huge crowd of raiders had approached the battle site. Rubbing his neck, the eater said that people didn't need to act like a steamroller and attack all at once. The man standing in front of the entire squad said that they took drastic measures to save Wing Historia and apologized for their behavior. The protagonist said that no one would forgive them after the treacherous blow to the head. However, the man ignored the monster's reply. He said that even though the time had passed, he would still introduce himself. A member of the Knightly Order of the Black Wolves, R. Eldebrae Gar Livistum greets the almighty Master Eater, the unknown man spoke with a smile. The main character was surprised to be called by his name and asked how people knew about it. The raider standing opposite said that it happened that one of his subordinates had a skill that he used to recognize the monster as a legend. The eater realized that the man was smiling now for a reason. He noted that he understood, but he was not in the best of moods. Once again going into an enhanced state, the protagonist said that the humans were causing his time to drain away. So he suggested to stop talking nonsense and attack. However, the squad leader, on the contrary, said that there was a misunderstanding between them. The Black Wolf Order has no desire to oppose Mr. Eater. On the contrary, they came here to come to an agreement. However, the protagonist was amused by this wording. He was surprised that the humans were so bold as to offer him some kind of treaty. The guy explained that they needed to assess the situation more clearly, otherwise such nonsense could lead to a cruel demise. The leader of the group of people thought that this was a lottery, the prize of which would be the safety of the empire. He told the eater that the owner of the brachycephalic tooth was still alive. Seeing the interest in the monster's eyes, the man said that surely the eater wasn't here because of some artifact. He added that people were willing to help with whatever he needed. However, the main character took a few steps towards the raiders and asked what would happen if he said he didn't need anything. The eater wondered how they would get out of the situation if he didn't come here for Masterpiece, but purely out of boredom to hunt people. Walking up close and pressing his forehead against his opponents, the guy asked how the Empire was going to deal with the aftermath. The group's leader said that at best, they would at least try to resolve things peacefully in the face of imminent doom. To this argument, the eater replied that if the people standing here wanted to stay alive, then they should find the owner of this masterpiece right now. Raider said they would fulfill everything and called Garrett over. A girl without a hand approached the opponents, standing in the distance. The head of the Black Wolves said that the eater must have already met her. The weakened girl said she needed the item to find out the owner's location. She asked her opponent for permission to examine the brachycephalic tooth. The guy pulled out the artifact and looked at the girl incredulously. He said that if Garrett threw out something funny, she wouldn't get by with one hand this time. The warrior replied that she understood perfectly and looked at Masterpiece. A few seconds later, the girl explained that there was one person who had many traces of this weapon on him. It was hard to pinpoint a specific point from a distance, but with the perspective of the capital, this owner was headed west. The eater realized that the roads once again led him to the village of Haston and the Wing Mage Tower. He said that this information would be enough for him. Now the monster was almost completely sure that Reny was still alive. After that, he exhaled peacefully, gathering astonished human gazes on him. Walking past the leader of the mop-up squad, the boy said that he owed them a debt of gratitude. The man responded by saying that it had been an honor to serve the eater. Then the monster took a quick step towards the teleporter, ordering the warrior standing in front of it to disperse. A short while later, he reached his destination, where Melia was already waiting for him. The demoness could barely stand on her feet, exhausted from the not-ending battle with the humans. She said the guy was a little late. The protagonist looked surprised at the corpses scattered around. The whole thing looked more like a graveyard than a teleportation site. Melia, somehow miraculously keeping herself on her feet, said that she kept her promise and defended the teleporter with dignity. Then, her hands unclasped. Before fainting, the girl said that if that was enough, she had returned the favor. The eater picked up his exhausted partner and said that was enough. After that, the demoness took her first form and fell asleep soundly. Guy stroked her with his tentacles and told her she had done well. Eater walked over to the panel for using the teleporter. He quickly figured out how to use it. The first thing to do was to enter Haston's coordinates and then pour in some mana. The protagonist did everything according to the procedure. However, the mana receiver's glass suddenly cracked. In the next instant, the entire apparatus shattered, shocking the Eater. Not realizing what had happened, the boy stared frustratedly at the destroyed teleporter. He thought that the receiver must have failed to hold his mana. Now the Eater had to use Demiura's containment effect on the transference magic. Surely in that mode he would be able to transfer without a problem, but to do so, he would have to reveal his true form. The protagonist thought that in that case it would be like a great self-promotion for the whole world. On the other hand, he's already done a lot of unnecessary things. It will be difficult to end it in the near future. With that thought, the guy put the bracelet on his arm and activated it. After that, the protagonist's body began to transform, taking its original form. The nearby neighborhoods shook as the sudden awakening began. Meanwhile, the building that housed the teleporter began to collapse from the inside. The very next second, there was an explosion in it, and streams of dark demonic energy burst outward from the rubble. Above the city block of the imperial capital, a monster of incredible size appeared with its head back. Immediately afterward, the Devourer activated the bracelet, setting the Wing Mage Tower as the end point. Meanwhile, in Haston, the sun had already gone below the horizon. A man standing near the entrance to the Mage Tower greeted the traveler and said he needed to know the visitor's data as a procedure. However, no sooner had he finished than he was interrupted by a girl standing across from him. She asked the man if it was possible to use transfer magic here. The mage said that this could not be done as there was a protective barrier on the tower, so you had to go through the necessary procedures to enter. Suddenly, the kid pulled out 3 sharp blades from nowhere. The stranger replied that in that case, the kid wouldn't be able to escape from here either. The next instant, blood splattered on the street tiles. Reny slashed her opponent's throat with impunity and strode toward the entrance. Even last time, she'd thought the human mage tower in Haston looked like an inverted dungeon. It was as if they were handcrafted trials that people had worked hard on. Passing room after room, Reny met resistance from the uncomprehending mages. However, none of them were able to oppose the girl in any way. A while later, the homunculus reached the stairs. All the mages she'd encountered on the first floor had been killed. Now all that remained was the final test in the form of the top of the tower. Grammat's aimer was already greeting the uninvited guest. Smiling, she said that she had been preparing herself and thinking about what kind of foe she would have to fight. However, the Magister did not expect to see the young lady who had come earlier in front of her. Now the Enchantress realized that all this time she had been communicating with a far-from-human being. Reny looked emotionlessly at her opponent, asked where brachycephalic toothslash. Grammat's aimer replied that the artifact now belongs to her, and she has the right not to answer such questions. Besides, there remained one of the serious questions that kept her on her toes. The Magister didn't understand how the girl managed to survive. Reny got into a fighting stance and prepared to attack. Grammat's aimer grinned and said that a girl with such a pretty face was not suitable for such a weapon. After that, the Enchantress created a magic shield. She asked, "Did the child really want to fight against the guild leader of a mage tower guild with a normal market?" Grammat's aimer was about to say, nothing could be done against this barrier with elemental weapons. However, at the same second, something swiftly whizzed past the woman. The sorceress realized to her horror that the girl had broken her barrier in just one blow. After what she had seen, she could not adequately assess the potential power of this monster. However, as the guild leader, she had an advantage as the tower was built on a huge mana source. Reny ordered the pathetic man to answer the question of where her brachycephalic tooth was now. The Enchantress swung her staff and, amplifying her aura, shouted that the masterpiece was no longer here, and it had probably already been sold at an auction in the capital. In the next instant, Grammat's aimer created something resembling a dome over the battlefield. The tower leader said that since the girl was serious, she would fight at full strength from now on. A moment later, the sorceress used an ability called Spear of Longinus to pierce her opponent with several spells. At the same second, there was an explosion in the building that partially destroyed the upper level of the tower. The room where the battle had taken place was immediately covered in dust. Reny stood on the ground bleeding, with several glowing lances sticking out of her body at once. The sorceress asked why the girl was acting like a human and then tearing up to such an outcome. Grammat's aimer thought that this kind of spell couldn't withstand most dungeon bosses. Such a weakling would definitely die from it. But in the next instant, 2 brightly glowing objects flew toward the sorceress. Her arms were almost completely severed below the elbow by the 2 blades thrown by Reny. The sorceress sat on her knees and cried out in pain. She stared in horror at the remaining stumps, unable to understand how this could have happened. However, Reny glared angrily at her opponent, telling her that she shouldn't yell since she had only lost both of her arms. Grammat's aimer turned around and tried to crawl away, screaming that she didn't want to die and she still had to live. Reny, however, kicked the crawling offender in the legs, which made her scream so again. The tower leader turned around and asked the girl to let her live. The homunculus stared blankly at his defeated opponent. It was all over now. As Lady Bathory had advised, the girl brushed her footprints behind her. Turning around, Reny walked towards the nearest exit. She didn't understand what she should do now. Walking over to the wall, the exhausted monster leaned against it and tried to stay on her feet. She had nothing left now. Reny began to feel drowsy from fatigue and she tried to stay on her feet. But suddenly someone's shout brought the girl back to normal and she looked away. A man named Chaim ran up to the sorceress lying on the ground. He shouted for the leader to hold on and by no means die. He asked Grammat's aimer if she could stand up, to which the girl replied that she had already said she was in pain. At first, the tower leader asked her to heal her, but then she said that we had to kill this girl first. Chaim looked at the monster indifferently. A bloodied Reny raised her eyes and looked back at the mage. The guy turned away and asked the leader to calm down as she had lost a lot of blood. He then showed Grammat's aimer the crystal and asked if she recognized the object. The exhausted sorceress looked at the artifact and said that she no longer understood what it was. Taking advantage of this, Chaim said that it was a stone of advanced magic that would help the girl get out of here. However, the guy himself doesn't have enough mana to activate it, so Grammat's aimer has to infuse him with her own. Reny looked at the crystal and saw in it the same thing that was in Scarlet's love stone last time. The girl hadn't forgotten that unpleasant aura at all. Without noticing the catch due to her clouded mind, the sorceress poured mana into the stone, thanking her subordinate that she could now live. But suddenly the crystal turned black, and Grammat's aimer realized the bitter truth. Her body began to be consumed by dark matter. Suddenly, a sharp pain seized the sorceress, and she screamed with all her might. Chaim stood up to his full height and said that Grammat's armor had made too many enemies. Otherwise, Miss Wren would not have come here for revenge. With a smile at the sorceress, the mage said that even the sorceress's family had asked to be rid of her at any chance. Chaim then turned around and thanked Mrs. Wren for doing his job. However, the guy felt that if he just left it at that, the girl might attack him as well. At this moment, Grammat's aimer's body began to transform into something sinister. Chaim shouted that he had to get out of here right away and wished Wren well. The monster killed him with a single tentacle swipe. By that point, Reny's right eye was completely blank. The opponent in front of her was not the kind of opponent she would be able to defeat with a tired body and mediocre weapons. Nevertheless, the homunculus calmly looked at the approaching danger and realized that it was still okay. Now she was ready to pay for her sins and get rid of her marks forever. But still, the girl was willing to die for a cause. Suddenly, she shouted furiously that with her pathetic actions, the monster was defaming the name of Mr. Eater himself. At the same second, Reny deftly jumped and plunged one of her daggers into the creature's eye. However, the forces were too unequal, and the monster immediately threw the annoying girl aside with one of its tentacles. As she flew, Reny was really hoping that Mr. Eater would at least think of her if he found out she was dead. Another explosion occurred in the mage tower. Dark energy was already pouring from its spire. But in the next instant, a huge creature several times the size of the wing's Bashni appeared in the very center of the village, destroying the guild headquarters in the process. A stunned Reny looked straight ahead of her. She should have been falling down, but still, something was holding her up. The first time she had been rescued, it had looked about the same. Strong arms held the girl, preventing her from falling while dozens of small shards flew down past her. Just like last time, when both soul and body were on the verge of life and meaning, the one who had saved her appeared in front of her. It was Mr. Eater. Reny stared at her savior, unable to believe what was happening. The protagonist lowered himself into a spot with his partner and set her on the ground. The girl couldn't understand why the boss was right here. As if anticipating such a question, the Eater said that she should just wait here for a while. The protagonist turned around and looked away. At that moment, Reny thought that maybe she was just hallucinating. Across from them, that strange monster was still alive. The Eater looked at the former human with hatred and said that now she would realize who they dared to touch. The guy then pounced on his subordinate's abuser with furious speed and with one mighty blow sliced them monstrously in half. Breaking into the creature's innards, the protagonist created dozens of spikes that instantly pierced the monster's body from within. The creature had no time to regain its senses and helplessly let out a long wheeze. However, the monster's small tentacles still did not stop moving. It was starting to annoy the protagonist. He effortlessly lifted the huge carcass and swung it in the air. The eater then flattened the creature with a mighty thud against the ground. From the force of the blow, the monster turned into some semblance of a flat mass of meat. To make sure his opponent was dead, the eater picked up the carcass and examined it. However, the monster was still not dead and continued to move its small offshoots. From what he saw, the protagonist began to get even angrier. He smashed the helpless creature to the ground again, shouting that it was just an abomination. A blue substance that looked like blood had already splattered almost all the wreckage of the buildings around. The eater's hands were also soiled. It was only after the third blow that he realized what was happening. This monster was revived time after time for a reason, and indeed, immediately after the third strike, the substance began to move again. After a few seconds, the meaty mass towered over the eater once more and screamed loudly at him. The protagonist guessed that the source of this monster's power was in the mana located in the mage tower. The guy smiled and said it was even easier in that case. He transformed into his true form almost instantly and simply ate whatever was within range of the tower's location. Taking on human form once more, the eater made his way towards Reny, complaining about the very nasty taste. The boy silently walked over and looked at the homunculus. She sat on the ground, turning away from the protagonist. The guy sat down with his back to his partner without further ado. After a brief silence, he said that he originally had many thoughts that he wanted to share when they met. However, now that they are talking, there is a void in his mind. Scratching his neck awkwardly, the eater decided to diffuse the situation by telling him that he had met a green-haired man on his way here and killed in his. However, Reny only squirmed even more and didn't reply anything to this foolishness. The protagonist raised his head and turned to his partner, sighing heavily. He apologized to the girl for what happened between them a couple of days ago. Suddenly, Reny replied that Mr. Eater had no reason to apologize to her, as she was unworthy to even look at him. The frustrated boy said that a protector like her was much needed by the dungeon. After that, there was silence in the air. The protagonist gathered his thoughts and said that Reny also needed him personally. The girl asked if the eater wasn't mad at her. The boy replied that he was indeed. Then the girl asked again, "Did the Lord not hate her?" The eater also replied that he had no reason to do so. Then the guy suddenly stood up and said he was just about to give something to his partner. Just then he pulled a brachycephalic tooth from under his cloak and held it out to Reny. The astonished homunculus held out his hands and couldn't hold back the tears. The girl wrapped her arms around Masterpiece and cried loudly. Her tears dripped directly onto the blade of the blade and flowed further onto the ground. Reny explained that she had been very badly frightened and thought Mr. Eater hated her and had abandoned her. The protagonist replied that he would never have thought of anything like that in his life. He then extended his hand to his partner and said it was about time they both went home. At that moment, Reny remembered her first day in the core of primordiality. Back then, the Eater had said he'd seen her when he'd solved the case of Graphenia's arson and had run into her again in the research lab. The guy thought it was just fate and brought the girl here. Pedric asked if all the research about homunculi was contained in one tiny body. In addition, the core of primordiality is a place where dark energy gushes forth, which is why this place is called the world of the dead. However, this girl is very good at holding her own while in the room of the strongest boss. Surely she must have a strong mind and body. Pedric then asked the boss what he was going to do with this lost girl. The Eater said he wanted to keep her here. The girl is very talented, so the protagonist decided to teach her how to fight. If this does not work out, then at least she will be able to live here comfortably. In addition, it is a homunculus with experience as a maid. Pedric was skeptical of the idea, asking who would be in charge of training this monster. The protagonist pointed at the skeleton without a second thought and wished him luck. Pedric asked indignantly why it was his responsibility, to which the guy replied that he was already complaining like he was bored. Skeleton thought that since it was a homunculus, her physical attributes must surely be at a high level, and deep down she must subconsciously hate humans. Pedric asked his boss what the girl's name was. The Eater lay down to rest, saying that he had heard her name, but did not remember it. Suddenly, the girl made some kind of sound. The skeleton was surprised that she could even speak. The homunculus replied that her name was Rello. Pedric asked if that was her full name, or if there was something else. The eater was surprised that a subordinate needed something else, to which the skeleton replied that since the boss was her boss now, he should give her a new name. The severely tired guy tried to think of something more original. However, he then settled on the name Reny. Skeleton liked that option. Turning around, he said they could call her Reny Rello now. But immediately, Pedric found that the boss was already asleep. The monster sighed heavily and turned to face the homunculus. Then he said that the girl should learn to smile first. With those words, he held out his bony fingers and made a fake smile on the homunculus's face. Now the eater was greeted in the dungeon by a very angry Pedric. He was furious, asking what the boss had done in Haston that had caused an earthquake even in the dungeon. He wondered if Mr. Eater had set up a drunken dance in the middle of their settlement. The protagonist replied that even in the lives of monsters, force majeure sometimes happens. The skeleton then pointed to the unknown that the eater was holding in his hand and asked what it was. The boy confusedly said it was a long story. Suddenly, the skeleton was scared that the protagonist had kidnapped some kid for some reason. The eater asked, "Did the skeleton really think he would do such a thing?" The enraged Death Knight asked the boss where Reny was and why he had brought some kid here. The sad monster replied that he wanted to talk about it. He explained that he had just met Reny in the human village. Already at this point, Pedric realized where this was going. Skeleton asked if the girl was okay, to which the protagonist replied that she was fine, but she looked tired. After a brief pause, the eater said that he was probably just keeping her quiet here. The Death Knight was silent for a moment, and then replied that it wasn't. Suddenly, Pedric asked in a rage why the guy wouldn't tell him directly that he was rejected. The protagonist covered his face with his paws in grief. A few seconds later, the eater told Pedric that it was time for him to put on his maid's costume and keep an eye on the dungeon. The Death Knight responded by saying that his resignation was always at the ready. After another short pause, the skeleton asked the boss what he was going to do. The boy lay down on the ground again and said that the only thing he could think of was to wait for Reny to come back again. Pedric sighed heavily and said he understood perfectly. The skeleton turned around and headed in the other direction of the shelter. At times like this, it was better to leave the boss alone. He would be depressed for a while, but sooner or later he would feel better again. But suddenly the Death Knight looked at the entrance and called out to the boss. Pedric then said that she was back. The boy asked who he was talking about, and the skeleton replied that it was the one he had been waiting for so much. Suddenly, Reny entered the room, dressed in a maid's outfit. She asked if Mr. Eater had eaten and if she should make dinner. Suddenly, Pedric found that something was wrong with the girl. Her right eye was a completely different color and was very familiar. The skeleton turned around and looked at the boss in horror. The Death Knight realized that the eater had sacrificed one of his eyes. The question remained, had he gone mad, and was it sincere? That night, the main character told the girl that her right eye was very badly hurt, and if she could see normally, she would have been able to notice it earlier. The guy explained that he didn't care at all if her feelings for him had changed. One way or another, he still wished he could help Reny. He took out his eye and put it in the girl's head, saying that she should bring him a real love stone next time. Now that Reny had made up her mind about her emotions, however, she was back and looked perfectly happy. Drops of condensation fell from the stalactites to the ground. One of them fell precisely on the forehead of the sleeping Melja. From such an unexpected alarm, the girl woke up. Rising and rubbing her sleepy eyes, she looked around and wondered what this place was and what had happened to her. But unexpectedly, the demoness found a skeleton sitting nearby, sharpening a knife. She asked fearfully if she had died and gone to hell, and the god of death was sitting in front of her. Pedric said it was not hell. He added that the girl was in the primordial core. The astonished Melja asked him to repeat these words. Before the skeleton could say anything, the girl immediately pointed her finger at him and said that he was Sir Pedric, the Death Knight. The skeleton confirmed her words and said that she was a quick learner. Pedric then stood up and looked around, wondering how long the gentleman would sleep. As he got closer, he kicked the huge carcass of the eater, telling him it was time for him to get up. The monster yawned, angry at his subordinate for waking him up. Then he saw that Melja was awake, and he said hello. The girl was both terrified and elated at the same time. She immediately fell to her knees, bowed before the ruler of the core of primordiality and the supreme commander of the demons, the protector of the god who punishes all who have consumed fear, the ancient beast that stands at the center of everything. Sir Eater. The nervous demoness apologized for not introducing herself. Then she said her name was Melj de Lymph Agrea, and she was the 17th daughter of Asmodeus. However, the same words were repeated by the Eater in sync with her. The protagonist said he remembered her perfectly well, as she had been very bright all along. The surprised girl asked how he could remember her name. Then she realized that perhaps Mr. Derham had already told him everything. Immediately, the girl started looking for her partner she was in the capital with. The last thing she could remember was Mr. Derham giving the final verdict to the people in the capital as well, and taking the brachycephalic tooth. Suddenly, a familiar voice answered that he was here. Melja asked Sir Eater if he had accidentally said that. The monster looked seriously at his guest and said that he was the one who was Mr. Derham. In those seconds, you could see the realization coming to her from the girl's face. Suddenly, Melja screamed in horror, for she had behaved so indecently right in front of the Eater himself. The skeleton asked what the girl had just said, to which the protagonist replied that she had behaved more appropriately before. However, Pedric said that he was referring to her words about the Eater passing the final judgment on the people in the capital. Looking fiercely into his master's eyes, the Death Knight asked if he had anything to share. The guy shrugged irritably, realizing that the current conversation was going to turn into him telling him off again. That's about how this hard but busy day ended. That same night, there was still someone in the forest of Graphenia, near the village of Haston. The herbalist with the oil lantern lamented that she had been told not to come in here. However, as expected, nothing happened to her. Besides, there are a lot of good medicinal herbs deep within the forest. Suddenly, there was a rumbling sound right behind her, and the frightened girl turned around. It was a badly wounded man who had fallen to the ground and did not move. The girl ran up to him, asking him how he was feeling. The guy was muttering something to himself, and the herbalist reached into her bag, saying she definitely had some medicine. No sooner had she gotten her hands on the first ingredients than immediately an unknown person pounced on her. Powerful blows followed, and human blood splattered the lantern standing nearby. After a brief fight, the guy dressed in his pre-made cloak and headed for the nearest path. His path lay toward a large city. The unknown cloaked man looked at the city walls and said he had to hurry. In this world, dungeons are considered a zone of endless fighting. Therefore, the main rule of survival remains the absence of conflict. That was the rule that was currently being broken in the primordial core. Reny was trying to convince Melja that silence was the foundation of the basics in the Eater's room. This issue was not up for discussion. In response, the demoness shouted that she refused to abide by this, for she was a free dungeon monster. Plus, she claimed to be a guest and had come here specifically to speak to the master, Sir Eater. Reny shouted incessantly that it was time for the master to go to bed. Melja took her second form and said that was why she was needed here. She explained that while the Devourer slept peacefully, she could snuggle into his body and share his warmth. Melja then pointed her finger at Reny and said that she was too old-fashioned for such things, for she was acting like a grandmother. The homunculus was enraged by such wording, and she lashed out at the offending woman with screams. Waving her weapon, Reny ran after her opponent, who was laughing at the top of her voice. Once again, watching such a scene made Pedric uncomfortable. He remembered once again the dungeon's cardinal rule of no conflict. Meanwhile, the main character said that the skeleton was the reason for all the commotion and he can't sleep. The Death Knight asked how the guy could even talk about it when there was a commotion outside because of him. The Eater turned around and asked if it was really that bad. It was then that Pedric realized that the protagonist hadn't read the papers he'd brought here. Then he sighed sadly and said that the Empire had gathered troops from all over the country to protect the capital. Because of this, the border settlements were ravaged by monster raids. But the worst part for them was that Lord Hastina had committed suicide, and because of this, the village was in a state of emergency. The most interesting point, however, lay elsewhere. Pedric said that he had been researching human newspapers for 3 weeks, and in all that time, he had been able to find only 3 headlines relating to news from Haston. He then looked meaningfully at the gentleman and asked if he understood what it meant. However, to the skeleton's surprise, the boss turned away and asked what it meant. This finally pissed off the Death Knight. He attacked the protagonist with reproaches, saying that he didn't think before answering, and at this rate, it was not far to dismissal. Once again, hearing about the resignation, the Eater began to apologize in every possible way. Yawning and sitting down on the ground, the protagonist asked his subordinate if he thought anything about the situation. The skeleton said he had a hunch, though he wasn't sure, as there wasn't enough information. However, the best outcome one could assume was that Haston simply cut all ties with the outside world. The Death Knight said that the protagonist should remember the destruction he caused there. So, not hearing from a settlement that has suffered devastating damage is definitely not a good thing. However, Haston is essential to the existence of the primordial core. As long as the monsters have the ability to follow the actions of the village, you can determine when and how large a conquest unit will come to conquer the dungeon. To restore the information base, Pedric said he needed to get to Haston because he didn't know what would happen if they were a little late. The eater laid down on the ground again and wished the skeleton good luck, telling him not to overwork himself. The boy hoped he wouldn't be called to go there in person. To his surprise, however, the skeleton showed no signs of agitation, and, agreeing with the gentleman, headed for the exit. The protagonist was glad that all he had to do was ask, and now he would be able to get a good night's sleep. Suddenly, however, Pedric said that no matter how much he wanted to, he couldn't do it alone. Skeleton looked at his boss and said that it would be good if someone else went with him. The protagonist jumped up from his seat and asked his subordinate to wait a little longer. He immediately looked at the girls fighting on the side, who immediately stopped. Melja was the first candidate to accomplish this task. However, it is mildly dangerous. If you compare it to types of magic, it is definitely explosion magic. If the girl uses the same ability as in the capital, there would be nothing left of Haston. In that case, the choice had to be on candidate number 2, who was also not averse to doing the job for the gentleman. While Melji was asking Reny to let go of her collar, the eater thought that the second option compared to the first was still much worse. Reny's main help in such tasks is her complete inactivity. At this point, Pedric fell to his knees and said that since they didn't know how long this mission would take, it would probably be best for the boss to go with him. The boy thought dejectedly that he had been caught in a net like a cheap fish, and there was no way to get away. Suddenly, an idea came to him. He said that he had broken Devaourer's bracelet last time, and now he couldn't transform. Pedric thought about it for a moment and said that it was indeed a problem. In that case, the protagonist really can't go with him. The eater was glad he didn't have to go after all, and shouted that now he could finally get some sleep. But suddenly he turned back into a human being. He looked at his hand in sadness and told the skeleton that he was not going to die easily. As he walked outside, Pedric said that the boss didn't even intentionally put a curse on him. Then he grinned and said that there was no point since his body was dead anyway. The Death Knight then snidely asked if the boss had lied to him, saying he couldn't go because of the lack of Devaourer's bracelet. The boy remained silent and answered nothing. Then the skeleton said that if the eater did possess the artifact, it meant that he was ready to go at any time. The annoyed guy yelled for the henchman to shut up. Sometime later, the travelers reached the gate of Haston. Looking at the ruins that had not been there before, Pedric noted that the boss had had a lot of fun here. Walking behind the wall, the skeleton said that the eater could see with 4 simple ways how alive this village was. First, they need to look at how many people are present in the shopping area. You can then see if there is smoke in the chimneys. You can do this during breakfast, lunch, or dinner, but it is too late now. Taking the tired boss by the scruff of the neck, the skeleton said that the third way was to check how many mercenaries and units were in the center of the conquest requests. But this option was not suitable for Haston. The latter option, however, is available to them at any time. You can check activity in hotels and bars. Pedric wanted to say that that was what they would do today, but the main character was no longer around. The eater told his subordinate that he was doing some useless crap and asked him to follow him. As they approached the inn, the Death Knight said they shouldn't hope for anything. However, the protagonist opened the door and shouted to the owner that he wanted to rest here. As the imperial newspapers conveyed the sentiment, the room was completely empty. Looking at the life that had finally died out, Pedric said that it was very, very bad. The place was now completely dysfunctional as a village. If one of the few hotels is empty, what to say about the rest of the setting? Looking around, Pedric assumed that Haston was indeed completely isolated. Suddenly, a human voice asked who was in the hall. Both travelers immediately tensed up. A man who identified himself as the owner of the hotel came out to them. Behind his back, he was hiding a knife in his trembling hand. The man asked the unknown men why they had come here. Pedric said he was a knight belonging to Peterian's Black Dogs unit of Natranger. The skeleton realized that the man was afraid of being attacked. The Death Knight explained that they could use a light snack and a place to sleep for the night. The owner realized he had visitors in front of him and apologized to them for everything they were seeing. He began to descend, saying that he would not be able to prepare food for the night. The owner explained that they were not the only ones who had such a problem, and wherever the travelers went in the village, they would have trouble finding food. The skeleton immediately asked if the reason would be revealed in the black disaster. The innkeeper realized that the knight was quite aware of it and said that he hoped the companions would understand him. Plus, he apologized for the fact that they also don't have any finished rooms at the moment either. Pedric thought about those words. Surely in this situation, the price of water would be more than the cost of living. The skeleton then made a sharp gesture with his hand and threw something to the innkeeper. After seeing the gold coin in the man's hand, Pedric asked again if there were still no rooms ready in this establishment. The innkeeper the same stepped aside and said that guests could go up the stairs. Suddenly, his attention was drawn to the second man. The man apologized and asked the knight who was coming with him. Pedric replied without hesitation that it was just his slave. The protagonist became angry upon hearing this, but the skeleton went on to say that although he was a slave, he was very useful, so the knight himself treated him accordingly. After that, the owner of the place took the guests to their room. The place wasn't as bad as the eater had thought it would be. The boy immediately took one of the beds, saying that there was a lot more room than where he and Melya had stayed in Riaz. Pedric agreed quickly, putting something in the nightstand. Suddenly, the eater asked, "Why was it worth calling him a slave?" The skeleton said that he couldn't do otherwise, because if the boss continued to walk around in these shabby rags, everyone around him would consider him a beggar. So it would be better if the people around him treated him at least as a slave. If someone thinks the guy is a beggar, there's a chance someone will pick a fight with him, but slaves are the property of their masters, so others can't just touch them. After mocking the gentleman to his heart's content, Pedric asked if the protagonist himself didn't want to move as little as possible. In response, the boy shouted that it was undoubtedly so, and promised that in his next life he would be reborn into stone. Pedric then closed the box and said that in that case the protagonist would have to obey him. The boy did not talk back, and said in the style of a slave that his master was very wise. Then the skeleton turned around and headed for the exit, saying that he would take a walk while the boss rested. The eater advised his subordinate not to work too hard, as this was only the first day. The Death Knight leaned out the window and looked around. He said that the Lord need not worry about him, for there was no finer place for him than night. After arriving at the center square of Black Catastrophe, the Imperial family reacted furiously to the monster's attack. It needed a target to take responsibility for the successive failed campaigns to the primordial core. But before the Empire could do anything about it, Lord Haston's lord, Count Etarch, died. Pedric looked at the notebook to see who was now running the village. Obviously an imperial family who had lost their chance to direct their fury at their relatives. Hence, the interesting question, could Count Etarch's heirs inherit his title? Standing on the roof of the Haston ruler's hall, the skeleton thought that perhaps he should see the current lord of the village. His attention was immediately drawn to the large number of guards. Despite the hunger and general desperation, someone could afford to keep a large, well-armed and fattened guard right at the entrance. Pedric realized that he could kill or knock them out quietly, but a fuss would be made as the sun rose. It would have been much smarter to take your time and wait for a better time. Walking down another block, the skeleton remembered one place that caught his attention. Ordinary people might not have noticed him, but not a monster like him. There was a strong corpse odor coming from this basement with a broken door. As the skeleton approached the stairs, he decided he needed to check the place out first. Meanwhile, the protagonist was looking for positive aspects of his unexpected journey. He decided that it was good to rest in a cool dungeon, but sometimes it was good to get out for a change. Eater lay back on the pillows and blankets, trying not to move too much. Suddenly, he heard footsteps outside the door. The boy realized that the people would not let him lie down in peace. Immediately afterward, there was a knock at the door. The owner of the place called out to Sir Knight, asking if he was inside. The protagonist came out and said that his master was out for a night walk. The owner said he understood perfectly well and suggested that the slave come downstairs. He explained that he had prepared some food. The owner explained that it was inappropriate for him to see his guests starving. And since the knight had paid a large sum of money, he could at least repay them in this way. The man then realized that he still hadn't introduced himself and said his name was Novan Hittiker. The protagonist responded by saying that his name was Po Gil. Heading down the hallway toward the stairs, the owner of the establishment said he hoped guests would not be disappointed. Food deliveries are so infrequent that very little has been prepared. The eater asked if things were really that bad. Novan replied that the name of the disaster spoke for itself. The locals, who had seen it with their own eyes, had fainted immediately. The owner of the lodge also narrated that it was because of these events that the Lord committed suicide. Now, as any guest could see, transportation to Haston was almost completely cut off. The whole area outside the castle walls was littered with the corpses of people who had died of starvation. Novin said that he did not know what purpose the travelers had come here for, but it was in their best interest to leave this place as quickly as possible. Suddenly, the eater thought he heard some strange sound from behind him. However, immediately, the owner casually said that the guy should understand how people behave in a situation where they are cornered. At the same moment, the second window in the living room came ajar. Then an unknown man in rags deftly jumped onto the windowsill. It was a young girl with red hair, dressed in dirty, tattered clothes. After waiting a while longer, she deftly jumped onto the faintly creaking floorboards. Looking around and surprised at the fact that she was alone, the girl smiled. This room smelled like a big score. Some idiots stayed in a place like this when the village was on the verge of disaster. Only strangers would do such a thing, and they'd paid for the most expensive bedroom. Such behavior could only suggest that these were just another reckless rich people. And that was to the young thief's advantage. Now she was quickly to rummage through the entire contents and lug away any item of any value. The girl grabbed the cloak on the bed, which seemed to be made of expensive fabric. The girl grabbed the cloak lying on the bed, which was apparently made of expensive fabric. So far, it didn't look like any rich people were staying here. Still, this cloak could come in handy for wrapping other things in it. The girl opened the room chest and was surprised that it was empty. That was too bad. I guess these guests carry everything with them after all. The thief rushed over to the wooden dresser and began rummaging through shelf after shelf. Only in one of the drawers lay something. The girl rejoiced and looked at the object, not realizing what lay before her. A sudden realization came to her, and then goosebumps ran down her back. If anyone lived here, these people were just nuts. A short while later, the eater went upstairs to his room again. A couple minutes later, Pedric came running into the room as well. He immediately said that he had jogged up to the Lord's castle and then asked the boss what he was doing. The lad replied slave style that the boss could see for himself. The skeleton took off his helmet and said that he would very much like to catch a glimpse of the new lord. But he had hired countless guards, and there was no way to do it quietly. Sitting down on the bed, the monster asked the gentleman if he had found anything in the meantime. The boy asked what it was all about, to which the skeleton replied that it was a question for the sake of a question. The eater sighed and said that Haston was cut off from the rest of the world, and other than that, the owner didn't know much else. Suddenly, the main character noticed that Pedric had a big change in his face. The boy asked what was wrong. In response, the subordinate once again began taunting his boss, saying that he had no idea that Haston's problems were that he was cut off from the world. Then the skeleton looked toward the street and said that tomorrow they would go together. Suddenly he said that he had left only one window open before he left, but now both were open. The protagonist immediately dismissed it, saying that he didn't even approach them. The skeleton incredulously said that the boss could have come up with a better excuse, because the wind could never have opened that window on its own. The guy said angrily that someone else had opened it, whether it was a ghost or a thief. Just then a realization came to both travelers, and they instantly jumped out of bed. The eater looked all over the room, but he couldn't find his outerwear. He couldn't believe that the gift Reny had made for him had been stolen. The skeleton also shouted that what he was leaving in the box was also gone. The protagonist asked what Pedric had left in that dresser. The monster looked bashfully at his boss and said there was his rib bone. Meanwhile, the young thief was moving quickly through the neighborhoods. Looking around, she hoped that at least this time she would be okay and make it to her destination. Suddenly, a man appeared across from the girl, calling her Rosalina. A man in light clothing, accompanied by two companions, asked the thief where she was going in the middle of the night. Rosalind did not answer, and then the strange type said that he had warned that it was forbidden for a girl to wander about the street so late. The thief justified herself by saying that she was not just running off somewhere, but was engaged in a common cause for the benefit of others. But the guy, on the contrary, became furious and said that unnecessary threat to life and additional loss of strength coupled with starvation would not help the others. The girl replied that it was not what he thought. Suddenly, more footsteps were heard behind them. The man said to the picky fellow named Tot not to push the girl too hard. Rosalind looked hopefully at the captain who had appeared out of nowhere. Tot was surprised that the leader was still awake. The captain dragged a chair behind him, saying that a thief should not be afraid of the night and should not be reprimanded for it in any way. Rosalind's main mistake, however, was that she left without warning anyone. The leader sat down in a chair and reminded her that it was still very dangerous outside as it was. He asked the girl to think about how much trouble she could bring to others because of her whim. The captain said this place was quite different from her former cozy and peaceful home. Rosalina replied that she understood everything perfectly well. The boss replied that it was good and asked what the girl had been doing. Immediately afterward, the thief unfolded a cloak that contained something. She laid out two strange-looking bones in front of the leader. Rosalina added that she thought she needed to do her part for their mutual survival. The captain asked the subordinate where she got it. The girl said the boss knew the place. She had robbed a hotel room on the main street. The girl explained that some rich people were staying in the most expensive room. These bones were lying deep in the drawers and were very clean. Rosalina was sure that it was an expensive artifact. However, the captain was quick to dispel her confidence that they would be able to make money off of it. He explained that the girl had risked her life for the most ordinary of human bones. The stunned thief said that she really couldn't have known about it. Todd asked if she had robbed the cemetery after all, but the girl denied it. The captain said these bones were definitely not from the cemetery. Otherwise, Rosalina wouldn't have been so proud when she showed her find. The leader thought that perhaps it was someone's horrible hobby of collecting things used for dark rituals. Todd asked if there were those who collected human bones. The captain said there are some twisted bastards who use the limbs of their disemboweled slaves as jewelry. Perhaps it really is the bone of a man or someone who once was. The main danger was that the owners of this artifact could be people practicing necromancy or black magic. It was the first time the captain had ever encountered anything like this. Even the rags the girl had brought were more like the clothes of a beggar than a rich nobleman. The strangest thing, however, was that the clothes themselves were sewn from the finest materials. Suddenly, something jingled in the cloak. The captain was surprised that Rosalind had forgotten about the pockets for some time. Sticking his hand in, the leader of the thieves pulled out an entire wallet of gold coins. The girl couldn't believe her eyes when she asked how many ounces there were. The captain shouted to his subordinates that, despite the amount of gold, it was not a good time to rejoice. But suddenly, an unknown voice said that the thieves were quite difficult to find. The other man agreed with his interlocutor, saying that this time they had come to the right place. It was then that the captain realized how much they had miscalculated. These men were staying at an expensive hotel in a ruined village. They had a piece of human rib and clothes sewn from the finest materials. The bandit realized that they had crossed the wrong people. When he turned around, he saw the stranger standing opposite him. It was a young boy in white rags and a bulky man in armor. The knight said hello to the stupid thieves and told them that they had come to take what was theirs.
Pet the cat.